Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a sound that echoes through the deepest halls of every Space Marine fortress monastery. It is not the ring of hammers on anvils, or the chanting of prayers to the god Emperor. It is something quieter than that. Something that most battle brothers try very hard not to think about when they pass through those vaulted corridors on their way to the armory or the training cages. It is the low, rhythmic hum of life support systems, keeping something alive that, by all rights and mercies, should have been allowed to die a very long time ago. Behind walls of adamantium and ceramite, sealed in chambers that are kept at temperatures cold enough to slow biological functions to a crawl, the oldest warriors in the Imperium of man sleep. And when I say sleep, I am using that word very loosely. Because what happens inside a Dreadnought sarcophagus between battles is not sleep. It is not rest. It is something far stranger and far more terrible than any mortal mind can truly comprehend. It is an existence caught between life and death, between consciousness and oblivion, between the memory of being human and the cold, mechanical reality of what you have become. Welcome to Q on 40,000. Tonight, we are going to talk about dreadnoughts. Not just what they are, not just what weapons they carry or how they perform on the battlefield. We are going to go much, much deeper than that. We are going to explore what it really takes to become one of these towering engines of war, from the ancient origins of the technology itself, all the way through the horrifying surgical process, the psychological toll, and the different patterns and variants that exist across the Imperium, and the stories of the legendary warriors who have been entombed within them for centuries and, in some cases, for millennia. Because here is the thing that a lot of people miss when they look at a dreadnought for the first time. They see the guns, they see the power fist, they see this massive armored walking tank that can tear through enemy lines and shrug off weapons fire that would reduce a normal human being to a red smear on the pavement. And all of that is true. A dreadnought is one of the most devastating weapons platforms that any Space Marine chapter can bring to bear on the battlefield. But what they do not see, what they cannot see, is the man trapped inside, or rather, what is left of the man. Because by the time a Space Marine earns the so-called honor of being interred within a dreadnought, there is often very little of him remaining, maybe a torso, maybe a head, maybe just enough of a brain and a spinal cord to interface with the machine's systems. Everything else has been stripped away by war, by injury, by the kind of catastrophic physical trauma that would kill anything less resilient than a genetically enhanced transhuman warrior. And even then, death should have claimed them. By every measure of medicine and biology, even by the extraordinary standards of the Imperium's apothecaries, these warriors should be dead. But the Imperium does not waste its heroes. Not when there is still use to be wrung from their broken bodies, or not when centuries of tactical knowledge and battlefield experience can be preserved within a shell of blessed iron and sacred adamantium. So they take what is left of the fallen hero, and they seal him inside a coffin that will become his entire world for the rest of eternity. They wire his nervous system into the machine. They fill his lungs with cold amniotic fluid. They replace his eyes with sensor arrays, and his voice with crackling Vox speakers. And then they tell him that this is an honor. That is what we are exploring tonight. The full, unvarnished truth of what it means to become a dreadnought in the 41st millennium. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin at the very beginning, in an age so ancient that even the Imperium has forgotten most of what happened there. The history of dreadnought technology stretches back further than most people realize. Far further. We are not talking about a few thousand years here. We are talking about tens of thousands of years, back to an era that the Imperium refers to as the Dark Age of technology. This was a period in human history that predates the Emperor's unification of Terra, predates the founding of the Space Marine legions, predates essentially everything that most citizens of the Imperium think of as history. During this golden age, humanity spread across the stars with a level of technological sophistication that, in many ways, has never been equaled since. They built thinking machines. They constructed wonders that modern tech priests can only dream of replicating. And somewhere in that vast crucible of innovation, someone built the first proto-dreadnoughts. Now, we do not know exactly what those earliest machines looked like or how they functioned. The records from that era are fragmentary at best, corrupted and incomplete, scattered across data vaults and archive worlds that have been lost and rediscovered and lost again over the millennia. What we do know is that the basic concept, taking a wounded or dying warrior and installing them inside a powered combat walker, has roots that go back to before recorded Imperial history. These were not the dreadnoughts that we know today. They were cruder in some ways and, according to certain fragmentary accounts, actually more advanced in others. Some sources suggest that these early machines could be piloted by ordinary humans, not just by space marines. The neural interface technology was different, perhaps less demanding on the occupant's biology, perhaps relying on systems that have since been lost to the passage of time and the catastrophic collapse of human civilization that followed the Dark Age. When the Age of Strife descended upon the galaxy and humanity's great interstellar civilization shattered into a million warring fragments, much of this technology was lost, but not all of it. On Mars, the tech priests of what would eventually become the Adeptus Mechanicus preserved fragments of the old knowledge, maintaining and venerating machines whose original purpose and design principles they no longer fully understood. On Terra itself, the techno-barbaric warlords who carved the planet into their own petty kingdoms possessed their own idiosyncratic versions of walking war machines, relics of the old age that had been maintained, modified, and passed down through generations of conflict. When the Emperor of mankind emerged from whatever long preparation had occupied the millennia of the Age of Strife and began his campaign to unify Terra under a single banner, these proto-dreadnoughts were among the weapons that saw action in the unification wars. The records from this period are heavily controlled by the Imperium, and much of what happened during the unification of Terra has been deliberately obscured or mythologized. But we know that walking combat walkers were present on the battlefields where the Emperor's Thunder Warriors, the predecessors to the Space Marines, fought to bring the warring nations of Terra to heel. It was during the Great Crusade, as that vast military campaign that followed the Emperor's alliance with Mars and the creation of the Space Marine legions, that dreadnought technology truly came into its own. The Mechanicum, drawing on their preserved knowledge and the Emperor's own technical expertise, developed and refined several patterns of dreadnought chassis that would become the standard for the newly formed legions. These were purpose-built war machines, designed from the ground up to house mortally wounded space marines, taking advantage of the Astartes' unique physiology and mental conditioning to create a symbiotic bond between warrior and machine that no ordinary human could replicate. The earliest of these formalized patterns included designs that would later become known by names like the Contemptor, the Deredeo, and others that have since been lost to history entirely. Each was built to serve a specific tactical role, from general assault to heavy fire support to specialized siege warfare. But they all shared that same fundamental principle: a mortally wounded space marine encased in a life-sustaining sarcophagus, interfaced with a combat walker through a mind impulse unit that allowed his consciousness to control the machine as though it were his own body. During the Great Crusade, as the Emperor's forces swept across the galaxy, reclaiming human worlds and conquering alien empires, dreadnoughts earned their place as some of the most revered and feared weapons in the Imperial arsenal. Each legion maintained its own roster of interred heroes, warriors who had fallen in battle but whose experience and skill were deemed too valuable to lose. These ancient fighters provided not just battlefield firepower, but also institutional memory, serving as living links to campaigns and conflicts that had passed beyond the recollection of their younger brothers. Then came the Horus Heresy, and everything changed. The galaxy-spanning civil war that erupted when the Warmaster Horus turned half the Space Marine legions against the Emperor had profound consequences for every aspect of Imperial technology, and dreadnought production was no exception. When the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror, Following their defeat at the Siege of Terra, they took their dreadnoughts with them. Cut off from the manufacturing capabilities of Mars and the technological infrastructure of the Imperium, the traitor forces found it increasingly difficult to maintain and produce new dreadnought chassis. Over time, this technological degradation, combined with the corrupting influence of the warp, would transform their interred warriors into something very different from their loyalist counterparts. But that is a story we will come to later. On the loyalist side, the heresy also took a devastating toll. The Mechanicum was torn apart by internal conflict during an event known as the Schism of Mars, and much of the knowledge required to produce the more advanced dreadnought patterns was lost or severely degraded. The Contemptor pattern, which had been the premier dreadnought chassis during the Great Crusade, became increasingly rare as the Imperium lost the ability to manufacture its sophisticated components in large numbers. The art of constructing certain weapon systems, like the Keras pattern assault cannon and gravity flux weapons, was lost entirely. In the centuries and millennia that followed, the Imperium adapted. The Castroferrum pattern Dreadnought, which used a more robust and easier to maintain thermic reactor instead of the Contemptor's advanced atomantic arc reactor, gradually became the standard chassis for most Space Marine chapters. It was smaller than the Contemptor, less sophisticated in many ways, but it was reliable, it was maintainable, and it could be produced in sufficient numbers to serve the needs of the 1,000 and more chapters that had been created from the original legions during the second founding. But even the Castroferrum was not easy to produce. The knowledge required to build new dreadnought chassis was jealously guarded by the Adeptus Mechanicus, and, in many cases, it was imperfectly understood even by the tech priests responsible for their construction. Each dreadnought was a priceless relic, to be maintained with religious devotion and preserved for as long as its systems could be kept functioning. When a dreadnought was destroyed in battle, Space Marines would fight with desperate ferocity to recover the wreckage, not just out of reverence for the fallen hero within, but because the chassis itself was often irreplaceable. Building new ones was possible, but rare, and the most distinguished specialists who dared to attempt it treated the process as equal parts engineering and sacred ritual. This is the technological inheritance that shapes the Dreadnought program in the 41st millennium. A combination of ancient knowledge, degraded manufacturing capability, sacred tradition, and desperate necessity. Every dreadnought that walks the battlefields of the far future is a product of this long and troubled history, carrying within it echoes of ages that most of the Imperium has long since forgotten. So, who actually gets chosen for interment? This is where we start to get into the heart of what it really takes to become a dreadnought, and the answer is both simpler and more complicated than you might expect. The simple answer is this: a Space Marine becomes a dreadnought candidate when he suffers injuries so catastrophic that even the extraordinary medical capabilities of the chapter's apothecaries cannot save him. We are talking about the kind of damage that goes far beyond what normal medicine, even transhuman medicine, can repair. Shattered spines, destroyed organs, limbs torn away, or bodies broken so completely that the warrior is reduced to little more than a collection of failing biological systems held together by willpower and the Emperor's grace. A Space Marine's physiology is already far beyond anything that a normal human being possesses. These are warriors who have been genetically modified with 19 or more additional organs, whose bones have been reinforced with ceramite, whose blood can clot almost instantly, whose bodies can enter a state of suspended animation to survive otherwise lethal trauma. They can survive injuries that would kill an ordinary soldier 10 times over. So when an apothecary looks at a fallen brother and determines that the damage is beyond his ability to repair, you can begin to appreciate just how severe those injuries must be. But catastrophic injury alone is not sufficient for interment. If it were, chapters would run out of dreadnought chassis in short order. The galaxy is a violent place, and Space Marines suffer grievous wounds with depressing regularity. No, The decision to enter a warrior within a dreadnought involves several additional factors that must align before the process can proceed. First and foremost, the warrior must be of sufficient standing within the chapter. Dreadnought interment is presented as the highest honor a space marine can receive, a chance to continue serving the Emperor and his chapter beyond the point where death would otherwise end that service. In practice, this means that the candidates are almost always veterans of long and distinguished careers. Chapter masters, company captains, veteran sergeants, chaplains, librarians, and other senior officers or legendary heroes whose tactical knowledge, leadership experience, and personal example are deemed too valuable to lose. An ordinary battle brother, no matter how brave his service, is unlikely to be selected for interment. It is not a matter of worthiness in any moral sense, but rather a cold calculation of value. A dreadnought chassis is one of the most precious pieces of equipment that any chapter possesses, irreplaceable in many cases, and the process of interment itself is complex, resource-intensive, and not always successful. The chapter's leadership must weigh the investment of a priceless relic against the value of what the interred warrior will bring to future campaigns. A veteran captain with 3 centuries of tactical experience represents a very different proposition than a young battle brother with a few decades of service, no matter how heroically he fell. There is also the question of availability. A chapter may have only a handful of empty dreadnought chassis at any given time, and some chapters have none at all. When a dreadnought's occupant finally dies, truly dies, the chassis must be maintained and prepared for its next tenant, a process that can take years. The sarcophagus must be cleansed and reconsecrated. The neural interface must be recalibrated for a new occupant. The machine spirit, that semi-sentient presence that the Adeptus Mechanicus believes inhabits all complex machinery, must be appeased and prepared to accept a new consciousness. This is not a quick or simple procedure, and there are often long periods where a chapter has warriors who might benefit from interment, but no available chassis to receive them. The timing of the decision is also critical. When a Space Marine falls on the battlefield, the window for successful interment is often extremely narrow. The warrior must still be alive, however tenuously. His brain must still be functioning. His consciousness must still be present, even if only as a flickering spark in a ruined body. If the apothecary reaches him too late, if the damage has progressed too far, if the brain has been deprived of oxygen for too long, then interment becomes impossible. The warrior is granted the Emperor's peace. His gene seed is harvested for future generations, and his name is added to the chapter's rolls of honor. This creates a scenario where the decision to proceed with interment must often be made in the chaos and confusion of an active battlefield. The apothecary must assess the fallen warrior's condition, determine whether interment is both viable and warranted, and then take immediate steps to stabilize the patient for transport. In some cases, this means performing emergency surgery under enemy fire, using every tool and technique at his disposal to keep the warrior's brain alive and his body stable enough to survive the journey back to the chapter's apothecarian, or, in the case of fleet-based chapters, to the medical facilities aboard their strike cruisers and battle barges. It is worth noting that the warrior himself does not always get a say in the matter. In some chapters, the decision to enter a fallen hero is made entirely by the chapter's leadership, often by the chapter master himself, in consultation with the chief apothecary and the master of the forge. The warrior may be unconscious or delirious from his injuries, incapable of giving informed consent. In other chapters, there is a tradition of asking the warrior if he wishes to continue his service in this way, but this is by no means universal, and even where such traditions exist, the warrior's refusal is not always accepted. The needs of the chapter, and by extension the needs of the Imperium, take precedence over individual preference. There are documented cases of warriors who begged not to be interred, who pleaded for the mercy of death rather than face the prospect of centuries sealed inside a metal coffin. The Night Lords. in their characteristically brutal fashion, would sometimes use Dreadnought interment as a punishment rather than an honor, forcing warriors who had displeased their leaders into the sarcophagus as a form of torture. But even among loyalist chapters, the decision is not always welcomed by the recipient. Some chapters are more forthcoming about the reality of what interment entails than others, and those that speak honestly about the psychological toll of the process occasionally find that their heroes would prefer to die with their honor intact rather than endure the living death that awaits them. But for most Space Marines, the cultural conditioning that has been drilled into them since their initiation makes refusal almost unthinkable. But they have been taught from the earliest days of their training that service to the Emperor is the highest purpose any being can aspire to, that sacrifice is not merely expected, but glorified, and that death in battle is the ultimate expression of devotion. When the apothecary tells them that the Emperor still has need of their service, when the chaplain tells them that this is the greatest honor the chapter can bestow, most warriors accept. Whether that acceptance comes from genuine faith, from a sense of duty, or simply from the overwhelming pressure of a culture that has shaped their every thought and impulse since childhood, is a question that each interred warrior must answer for himself, alone, in the darkness of his metal tomb. There is one more factor that bears mentioning in the selection process. Yes, and it is perhaps the most important one of all: compatibility. Not every Space Marine, regardless of his rank or the severity of his wounds, is physically capable of surviving the interment process. The neural interface that connects the warrior's consciousness to the Dreadnought systems places enormous demands on his brain and nervous system. Even Space Marines, with their enhanced physiology and mental conditioning, can be overwhelmed by the shock of the procedure. There are accounts, particularly in the novel The Unforgiven, that describe the process of implanting the neural connectors as so agonizingly painful that it can sometimes kill a Space Marine outright. And these are beings with some of the most effective pain suppression capabilities in the galaxy. What if the implantation of the connectors is enough to overwhelm a Space Marine's legendary resilience? You can begin to appreciate just how extraordinarily traumatic the process truly is. The apothecary must assess not just the warrior's physical condition, but also his neurological integrity. Has the brain suffered damage that might compromise the interface? Is the spinal cord intact enough to carry the signals between the warrior's nervous system and the machine's control systems? Are the warrior's mental faculties sufficiently preserved to maintain the kind of complex, real-time cognitive processing that controlling a Dreadnought requires? These are questions that must be answered before the process can proceed, and in many cases, the answers are not what the chapter's leadership hopes to hear. Whereas all of this means that the actual number of Space Marines who are selected for Dreadnought interment at any given time is vanishingly small. Out of the 1,000 or so Battle Brothers that a typical Codex-compliant chapter maintains, there may be only a handful of active Dreadnoughts at any one time, and many chapters have fewer than that. Each one represents a convergence of factors: catastrophic injury, exceptional service record, available chassis, viable neurological condition, successful surgery, that together make interment one of the rarest and most significant events in any chapter's history. When it does happen, when all of these factors align and a fallen hero is deemed worthy and capable of interment, the process that follows is nothing short of extraordinary, and that is what we need to talk about next. Yet the interment process itself is, without exaggeration, one of the most harrowing procedures in all of Imperial medicine. And when you consider that Imperial medicine includes things like the full Astartes organ implantation sequence, the Rubicon Primaris crossing, and the genetic restructuring that creates a custodian guard, that is saying something genuinely staggering. It begins, as most terrible things do, with a journey. The fallen warrior must be transported from the battlefield to wherever the chapter's surgical facilities are located. For chapters based in fortress monasteries, this means getting the warrior back to their homeworld, which can involve days or even weeks of travel through the warp. For fleet-based chapters like the Black Templars or the Iron Hands, the facilities may be aboard a battle barge or strike cruiser, which is somewhat more convenient, but still requires evacuating the casualty from an active combat zone and getting him to the ship's apothecarian in time. During this transit period, the warrior is kept in a state of medically induced stasis. His remaining biological functions are slowed to the absolute minimum necessary to preserve brain function. He is pumped full of every anti-shock, anti-inflammatory, and tissue-preserving compound in the apothecary's arsenal. In some cases, the warrior is conscious during part or all of this process, aware of what is happening to him, but unable to do anything about it. The pain, even with Space Marine physiology and all the pharmacological support available, is reportedly indescribable. These are warriors who have been conditioned to endure levels of suffering that would break any normal human being, and the accounts we have suggest that the injuries severe enough to warrant Dreadnought interment push even their legendary tolerance to its breaking point and well beyond. Once the warrior reaches the surgical facility, the real work begins. The first stage involves a thorough assessment of what remains. The chapter's apothecaries, working in concert with tech marines, and sometimes with representatives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, must determine exactly which biological systems are still functional, which can be preserved, and which must be discarded entirely. In many cases, this assessment reveals that the warrior's body is in far worse condition than the initial battlefield evaluation suggested. Internal injuries that were not apparent in the field become visible under more thorough examination. Organ systems that seemed intact turn out to be failing. Tissue necrosis has set in despite the best efforts of the emergency treatment protocols. What follows is a process that is equal parts surgery and butchery. Any body parts deemed non-essential for the warrior's continued survival within the sarcophagus are removed. And when they say non-essential, they mean it in the coldest and most clinical possible sense. Limbs are amputated. Damaged organs are excised. In some cases, so much of the warrior's body is removed that what remains is barely recognizable as something that was once a person. You might be left with a torso, a head, and the critical organs necessary for brain function, the heart, the lungs, yet enough of the circulatory and respiratory systems to keep oxygenated blood flowing to the brain, sometimes less than even that. The second stage is the preparation of the sarcophagus itself. This is not simply a matter of opening a hatch and sliding the warrior inside. Each sarcophagus must be individually calibrated to its new occupant. The life support systems must be tuned to accommodate the specific configuration of remaining biological tissue. The neural interface must be mapped to the warrior's individual neural architecture, a process that involves incredibly detailed scanning and calibration work. The amniotic fluid that will fill the sarcophagus must be prepared to the exact chemical composition that will sustain this particular warrior's remaining biology, which varies depending on which organs remain functional and which have been replaced by mechanical systems. The sarcophagus itself is a marvel of Imperial engineering, though the word marvel perhaps understates the horror of what it represents. It is essentially a sealed coffin made of armored materials, filled with thick, cold amniotic fluid that serves multiple purposes. It sustains the warrior's remaining organic tissue. It acts as a shock absorber, protecting his fragile biological components from the tremendous forces generated when the Dreadnought walks, runs, fights, and absorbs enemy fire. It provides a medium through which nutrients and oxygen can be delivered to his cells and waste products can be removed. And it fills his lungs, forcing him to breathe liquid instead of air, as a sensation that by all accounts is profoundly disturbing even for a being as heavily conditioned as a space marine. The third and most critical stage is the neural interface connection, which is accomplished through a piece of technology called the Mind Impulse Unit. This is the bridge between the warrior's consciousness and the Dreadnought's mechanical systems. Through the Mind Impulse Unit, the warrior can see through the Dreadnought's sensor arrays, hear through its audio pickups, feel the feedback from its limbs and weapons, and control the entire machine as though it were his own body. It is this connection that transforms a Dreadnought from a mere vehicle into something more, a true extension of the warrior's will. But establishing this connection is where the process becomes most dangerous and most painful. Where the input cords that connect the warrior's nervous system to the mind impulse unit must be physically implanted, stabbed into nerve clusters and neural pathways with surgical precision. Each cord is a conduit for information, carrying signals back and forth between the organic brain and the mechanical body at speeds that allow for real-time control. The sheer volume of sensory data that flows through these connections is enormous. Far more than a human brain is typically required to process, and the initial flood of input when the system is first activated has been described as overwhelming in the most literal sense of the word. There are accounts in the lore, particularly from the novel The Unforgiven, that describe this moment of connection as being so intensely painful that it can kill a space marine through sheer neurological shock. Remember what we said earlier about space marine pain tolerance? These are beings with hypnomimetic psychoreactive blocks designed to protect their minds from exactly this kind of trauma. With hormone systems that can flood their bodies with the most powerful natural painkillers imaginable, with mental conditioning that allows them to function under levels of physical distress that would render a normal person catatonic. And the neural interface implantation can still overwhelm all of that. The apothecaries performing the procedure must monitor the warrior's neural activity in real time, ready to intervene at the first sign that his brain is being pushed past its breaking point. Even with all of these precautions, not every warrior survives the connection. For those who do survive, and the experience has been described in vivid and unsettling terms. The warrior must immediately focus all of his mental energy on controlling the Dreadnought, on interpreting the flood of mechanical sensory data and translating it into something his organic brain can process. If he allows his attention to drift, if he lets his consciousness return to its natural state of bodily awareness, he becomes immediately and overwhelmingly aware of what has been done to him. He feels his butchered and crippled physical body. He feels the cold, thick fluid filling his lungs with every breath. He feels the stabbing intrusion of the input cords penetrating his nervous system. The sensation is reportedly so horrifying that warriors who experience it for the first time often scream, their mechanical voices crackling through vox speakers in a sound that no one who has heard it ever forgets. The fourth and final stage of the process is the integration of the sarcophagus into the Dreadnought chassis itself. Once the warrior has been successfully connected to the mind impulse unit and his life support systems are functioning within acceptable parameters, the sarcophagus is physically installed in the torso of the Dreadnought body. The connections between the sarcophagus and the chassis are made, linking the warrior's neural interface to the Dreadnought's weapon systems, locomotion, sensors, and communications equipment. The armored plates that protect the sarcophagus are sealed shut. The Dreadnought's reactor is brought online, flooding the machine with power. And for the first time, the warrior feels his new body stir. This moment, the moment of first awakening within the Dreadnought, is one that every interred warrior describes with a mixture of awe and revulsion. Where once the warrior had hands, he now has weapon mounts. Where once he had legs, he now has piston-driven hydraulic actuators. Where once he saw through his own eyes, he now perceives the world through a complex array of optical sensors, Auspex scanners, and targeting systems that paint his surroundings in a very different light than flesh eyes ever could. His voice, that most personal and intimate expression of individual identity, has been replaced by the synthetic, crackling tones of a vox speaker system that translates his thoughts and emotions into something that resembles speech but is not quite the same. The warriors around him, his battle brothers, look up at him and see a towering engine of destruction, a walking monument to sacrifice and duty. They see glory. They see the Emperor's will made manifest in iron and adamantium. What they do not see, what they cannot see, is the man inside, floating in cold fluid in the darkness, struggling to reconcile the memory of what he was with the reality of what he has become. Once the interment is complete and the warrior has had time to acclimate to his new form, there is typically a period of testing and calibration. The tech marines run diagnostics on every system, checking weapon targeting, locomotion, sensor arrays, communication equipment, and the dozens of other subsystems that must function correctly for the Dreadnought to be combat effective. The warrior practices moving in his new body, learning the feel of each step, each turn, each weapon discharge. For a being who has spent centuries fighting in power armor, intimately familiar with every nuance of his own physical capabilities, this period of adjustment can be deeply disorienting. The Dreadnought moves differently than a human body. Its center of gravity is different. Its proportions are different. The feedback from its mechanical limbs, while sophisticated, is still fundamentally different from the proprioceptive sense that allows an organic body to know where its parts are in space without looking at them. Eventually, though, most warriors adapt. The Space Marine's genetically enhanced brain is capable of remarkable plasticity, and the mental conditioning they have undergone since childhood gives them tools for adapting to new situations that would be beyond most human beings. Given time and practice, yet an interred warrior can learn to control his Dreadnought body with a level of dexterity and precision that observers find genuinely surprising for a machine of its size and bulk. Dreadnoughts can walk and balance with the ease of a living creature, navigate difficult terrain, engage in complex close combat maneuvers, and perform the kind of fine motor tasks that you would not expect from a walking tank standing several meters tall and weighing multiple tons. But there is a price for all of this. There is always a price. Now that we understand how a warrior becomes a Dreadnought, we need to talk about what he becomes, because not all Dreadnoughts are the same. Over the long millennia of Imperial history, dozens of distinct patterns and variants have been developed, each designed to serve a specific tactical role, and each carrying its own unique characteristics, advantages, and limitations. Understanding these patterns is essential to understanding what it means to be a Dreadnought, because the specific chassis a warrior is interred within has a profound impact on his capabilities, his experience, and in some cases, his very survival. The most common pattern of Dreadnought in service during the 41st millennium is the Castroferum, and specifically the Mars Castroferum pattern, Mark IV and Mark V. This is the iconic Dreadnought that most people picture when they hear the word. It is that boxy, angular silhouette with a weapon arm on one side and a massive power fist on the other, an armored sarcophagus mounted in the center of its torso, and a compact but powerful frame that stands several meters tall. The Castroferum is the workhorse of most Space Marine chapters, a versatile and reliable chassis that has been in continuous production in one form or another for thousands of years. The Castroferum was designed to replace the older and more sophisticated Contemptor pattern, which had been the standard Dreadnought chassis during the Great Crusade, but became increasingly difficult to produce and maintain after the technological losses of the Horus Heresy.
Honestly, before we keep going, I just want to take a second here because this is genuinely one of my favorite topics in all of 40K. I've been reading about Dreadnoughts since I first got into this hobby, and the thing that keeps pulling me back is that they are not just cool looking war machines. They're a story about what it means to lose yourself piece by piece and still keep going. That hits different when you sit with it for a while. Out of every Dreadnought story I have come across, Rylanor's is the one that genuinely got me. 10,000 years alone on a dead planet, holding onto one single purpose. Just to look Fulgrim in the face and say no. That's not just good lore, that's one of the best character moments in any fictional setting I have ever experienced. And if you've not read that part of the Horus Heresy books, please do yourself a favor. But anyways, that's just my take. Let's go back to the video.
Where the Contemptor used an advanced atomantic arc reactor that generated enormous power, but required exotic materials and specialized knowledge to manufacture, the Castroferum uses a more conventional thermic reactor that is easier to build, easier to maintain, and easier to fuel. And this made it the practical choice for a post-heresy Imperium that was struggling to maintain its technological base while fighting wars on 1,000 fronts simultaneously. In appearance, the Castroferum is noticeably different from the Contemptor. It is shorter and more compact, with a lower profile that makes it better suited for certain tactical roles, like boarding actions, tunnel fighting, and subterranean combat. Its legs are less articulated than the Contemptor's, giving it a somewhat more mechanical gait, but they are also more robust and less prone to the kind of catastrophic failure that could leave a more complex design immobilized on the battlefield. The armor is configured heavily toward the front, prioritizing protection in the direction the Dreadnought is most likely to be facing the enemy, as with somewhat lighter coverage on the rear and sides. The Castroferum's weapon options are extensive. Its right arm can mount a variety of heavy weapons, including assault cannons, twin-linked las cannons, plasma cannons, multi-melters, and missile launchers. Its left arm typically terminates in a Dreadnought close combat weapon, essentially a massive power fist with an underslung storm bolter or heavy flamer, though some variants replace this with a second ranged weapon for a pure fire support configuration. The combination of heavy ranged firepower and devastating melee capability makes the Castroferum a flexible battlefield asset that can be configured for a wide range of tactical roles. The standard Castroferum has spawned numerous specialized variants over the millennia. The ironclad Dreadnought features reinforced frontal armor and specialized siege equipment, making it ideal for assaults on fortified positions. The Hellfire Dreadnought mounts dual heavy weapons for dedicated fire support. The Siege Dreadnought carries specialized equipment, including inferno cannons and rock drills designed for breaching fortifications. Each of these variants represents a different answer to a specific tactical problem, and each chapter maintains its own preferred configurations based on its preferred doctrines and the enemies it most commonly faces. Moving back in time, the Contemptor pattern Dreadnought represents the pinnacle of pre-heresy Dreadnought design for the standard Legiones Astartes. Taller and more elegantly proportioned than the Castroferum. Yet the Contemptor has a distinctly more humanoid appearance, with fully articulated limbs that give it a level of agility and grace that seems almost out of place on a machine of war. Its advanced atomantic reactor, a masterpiece of engineering whose full principles are no longer fully understood by the Adeptus Mechanicus, generates significantly more power than the Castroferum's thermic reactor, allowing it to mount energy-hungry weapons and defensive systems that would be beyond the capacity of a lesser chassis. One of the Contemptor's most notable features is its atomantic shielding, a protective energy field generated by its reactor that provides a degree of protection against incoming fire beyond what its physical armor alone could achieve. This field, while not as powerful as the void shields mounted on Imperial Titans, it gives the Contemptor a survivability advantage that few other Dreadnought patterns can match. The downside is that when the reactor is critically damaged, the resulting energy discharge can be catastrophically more violent than a simple mechanical failure, posing a danger to nearby friendly forces as well as the enemy. The Contemptor could also mount a range of exotic weapons that have since been lost to the Imperium's declining technological base. The Keres pattern assault cannon, a precursor to the assault cannons used by Terminator-armored space marines, was one of the most common. Compact plasma blasters, graviton weapons, and other devices whose operating principles are no longer fully understood were also part of the Contemptor's arsenal during the Great Crusade era. In the 41st millennium, those few Contemptor chassis that survive are jealously guarded relics, too precious to be deployed except in the most desperate circumstances. They are maintained with fanatical devotion by tech marines who understand that each one is a link to an age of greater technological sophistication that may never come again. The Dreadnought pattern. Dreadnought was a contemporary of the Contemptor, developed alongside it during the Great Crusade as a dedicated heavy support platform. Where the Contemptor was designed as a general assault unit capable of both ranged and melee combat, the Dreadnought was purpose-built for long-range fire support. Its stockier frame, with a distinctly different silhouette from the more humanoid Contemptor, was designed to absorb the recoil forces of its heavy weapons while providing a stable firing platform. The Dreadnought mounted specialized weapons not found on any other pattern, including the Anvilus autocannon battery, a fearsome development of the standard autocannon designed specifically for anti-armor work, and the Iolos missile launcher, an advanced guided missile system that could engage targets beyond line of sight and from unexpected angles. Like the Contemptor, the Dreadnought has become exceedingly rare in the 41st millennium, with only a handful of examples known to survive in the armories of the oldest and most prestigious chapters. When one of these ancient war machines is brought onto the battlefield, it is a statement of how desperate the situation has become, and a harbinger of the destruction that is about to be visited upon the enemy. Then there is the Leviathan pattern siege Dreadnought, which occupies a very different place in the hierarchy of Dreadnought designs. The Leviathan was developed in the latter days of the Great Crusade, crafted in limited numbers in secret facilities on Terra, away from the oversight of the Mechanicum. It is significantly larger and more heavily armored than either the Contemptor or the Castroferum, a hulking brute of a machine designed for one purpose above all others: to break sieges. Its armament reflects this specialization, with options including storm cannons, siege claws with built-in melter guns, siege drills, and volkite weapons, all mounted on a chassis that can absorb an extraordinary amount of punishment. But the Leviathan carries a dark reputation even among Dreadnought pilots, which is saying something. Yet the unique technologies incorporated into its design place a terrible strain on the warrior interred within. Unlike the relatively gentle, if that word can be used in this context, decline experienced by pilots in other Dreadnought patterns, a warrior inside a Leviathan is subjected to a constant, grinding assault on his sanity. The machine spirit of the Leviathan is described as hungering, seeking to devour the mind of its pilot, trapping him in endless flashbacks and hallucinatory experiences drawn from the Heresy-era battles that the machine seems to remember from its own past or from previous occupants. Those few Leviathans that survive into the 41st millennium are deployed only in the most extreme circumstances, and the warriors interred within them are understood to be paying a price far heavier than even the standard Dreadnought's already terrible toll. The arrival of the Primaris Space Marines, created by Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Cawl during his 10,000-year research program, brought with it a new generation of Dreadnought technology that represented the first major advancement in the field since the Horus Heresy. The Redemptor pattern. Dreadnought was designed specifically to serve alongside the Primaris Marines, and in many ways, it represents the culmination of Cawl's efforts to push the boundaries of what Imperial science can achieve. The Redemptor is visibly larger than the Castroferum, standing taller and broader, with a more articulated frame that recalls the Contemptor's elegant proportions while incorporating distinctly modern engineering sensibilities. It is powered by hyper-dense plasma reactors that generate enormous energy, feeding sophisticated fiber bundles that serve as the machine's muscles and allowing it to achieve feats of speed and agility that seem improbable for its size. A Redemptor can accelerate from a walking pace to a thunderous, ground-shaking sprint that allows it to cross open ground and close with the enemy before they can react. And it can do so while absorbing hails of fire that would stagger lesser machines. The Redemptor's weapon options are devastating. One arm typically mounts either a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, on a rotary weapon capable of shredding entire squads of infantry in a single sustained burst, or a macro-plasma incinerator, which harnesses energy comparable to a captive sun to melt enemy tanks to bubbling slag. The other arm terminates in a massive Redemptor fist, a power fist so large and powerful that it can crush a Carnifex's skull or tear open the flank of a Necron monolith with a single blow, with an underslung heavy flamer or Gatling cannon for supplementary firepower. Additional weapons including Fragstorm grenade launchers, Storm bolters, and Icarus rocket pods for anti-aircraft defense can be mounted on the chassis itself, giving the Redemptor a density of firepower that rivals some light vehicles. The Redemptor also spawned several specialized variants, each designed for a specific combat role. While the Brutalis Dreadnought is configured for maximum close-quarters lethality, mounting twin Brutalis fists or Brutalis talons, along with hull-mounted heavy bolters or multi-melters. It is a pure assault weapon, designed to close with the enemy at speed and tear them apart in a whirlwind of crushing blows and raking claws. The Ballistus Dreadnought goes in the opposite direction, mounting a versatile ballistus missile launcher, capable of firing both fragmentation and armor-piercing missiles, alongside a twin-linked lascannon, making it a fearsome ranged weapons platform optimized for engaging heavily armored targets at distance. But for all its power and sophistication, the Redemptor carries a dark secret that has become one of the most troubling aspects of Primaris Dreadnought technology. But the tech priests who designed the Redemptor under Call's direction showed what can only be described as a callous disregard for the health and longevity of the warrior interred within. The machine's advanced systems, its hyperdense reactors and enhanced neural interfaces place a strain on the pilot that goes far beyond what older patterns demand. Where a warrior in a Castroferum or Contemptor can theoretically survive for millennia with proper care and maintenance, a warrior in a Redemptor faces a far shorter tenure. Many of those Redemptors that have fought for sustained periods have already had their sarcophagi replaced, their original pilots burned out by the intensity of the machine's systems. The surging energies of the Redemptor's reactor have been documented as literally leeching the life force from its occupant over time, gradually consuming him until nothing remains but a sack of blackened organs, fit only to be laid to rest in a true mausoleum. The pilot is treated, in the cold calculus of the mechanicus mind, as simply another component to be used and replaced as necessary. A part of the machine, no more or less important than a reactor coil or a servo actuator, to be interred when useful and discarded when spent. This represents a fundamental philosophical shift from the traditional Imperial approach to Dreadnought technology. The older patterns, for all their horror, at least offered the possibility of near immortality. A warrior interred in a Castroferum could, in theory, serve for 10,000 years, as Bjorn the Fell-Handed has demonstrated. The machine preserved its occupant, even if the quality of that preservation left much to be desired. While the Redemptor does not offer this, it consumes its pilots, burning through them like fuel, offering enormous power in exchange for a dramatically shortened existence within the sarcophagus. Whether this represents progress or yet another example of the Imperium's casual cruelty toward its own servants is a question that different characters in the lore answer very differently. The existence of the Redemptor and its variants raises uncomfortable questions about the future direction of Dreadnought technology in the Imperium. As the Primaris Marines increasingly replace the Firstborn as the standard Astartes, and as the Redemptor and its derivative patterns increasingly replace the Castroferum as the standard Dreadnought chassis, the Imperium may be trading the ancient horror of indefinite entombment for a newer, arguably more merciful but also more wasteful alternative. A warrior interred in a Redemptor will not endure the centuries of psychological erosion that plague older Dreadnoughts. He will not slowly lose his memories, his personality, his humanity over the course of millennia, but he will die, relatively quickly by Dreadnought standards, consumed by the very machine that was supposed to give him a second chance at service. Whether that is a better fate or a worse one is, perhaps, a matter of perspective. One of the most fascinating aspects of Dreadnought lore is how individual Space Marine chapters have adapted the base technology to reflect their own unique cultures, doctrines, and genetic heritage. While the underlying principle remains the same, a mortally wounded warrior interred in a combat walker. While the specific expression of that principle varies dramatically from chapter to chapter, some of these variations are purely practical, modifications to weapon loadouts, and armor configurations to suit particular tactical preferences. Others are far more profound, reflecting fundamental differences in how different chapters view the relationship between warrior and machine, between honor and horror, between life and the thing that comes after it. The Blood Angels and their many successor chapters provide perhaps the most dramatic example of how a chapter's unique genetic heritage can interact with Dreadnought technology in unexpected and often tragic ways. The Blood Angels carry within their gene seed the imprint of their primarch Sanguinius, whose death at the hands of Horus during the Siege of Terra left a psychic scar that has affected every subsequent generation of the chapter. This manifests as two genetic flaws that plague the sons of Sanguinius: the red thirst, an overwhelming craving for blood that can reduce even the most disciplined warrior to a feral state, and the black rage, a psychic echo of Sanguinius's final moments that causes affected warriors to relive their primarch's death in vivid, hallucinatory detail, losing all sense of their own identity as they become consumed by visions of a battle that happened 10,000 years ago. For most Blood Angels, the black rage is held at bay by meditation, willpower, and the spiritual guidance of the chapter's sanguinary priests and chaplains. But it is always there, lurking in the depths of their psyche, waiting for a moment of weakness or extreme stress to surge forth and claim them. When it does, the affected warrior is inducted into the Death Company, a unit of doomed warriors who are given the chance to spend the fury of their madness against the chapter's enemies before their condition inevitably claims their lives or their sanity beyond all recovery. What makes this relevant to our discussion is that Dreadnought interment does not protect a Blood Angel from these genetic curses. A warrior sealed inside a sarcophagus, floating in amniotic fluid, with his nervous system wired into a combat walker, can still succumb to the black rage. And when he does, the results are catastrophic. A Dreadnought that has fallen to the black rage becomes an almost unstoppable force of destruction. You're driven by the same psychotic fury that consumes its infantry-scale brothers, but now housed in a body that can shrug off weapons fire that would tear apart a battle tank. These afflicted machines are designated Death Company Dreadnoughts, and they are among the most dangerous entities on any battlefield where they are deployed. When a Blood Angel's Dreadnought succumbs to the black rage, the chapter faces an immediate and serious problem. The raging machine cannot be easily subdued or controlled. It will attack anything in its path, friend and foe alike, driven by visions of enemies that existed 10,000 years in the past. The chapter's tech marines must devise ways to disable the machine, often requiring specialized equipment and considerable personal risk. Since a Death Company Dreadnought is not inclined to cooperate with attempts to shut it down, once the machine is disabled, the sanguinary priests assess the warrior within. If he retains enough sanity to follow basic directions and can be aimed at the enemy rather than at his own brothers, he may be allowed to fight on as a Death Company Dreadnought, deployed into the most dangerous combat situations where his uncontrollable rage can be used as a weapon rather than a liability. If he has deteriorated beyond even that minimal threshold, he may be relieved of duty permanently, his sarcophagus removed, and a new warrior interred in the chassis to carry on its service. The Blood Angels also maintain a unique variant known as the Furioso Dreadnought, which reflects the chapter's cultural preference for close combat. Where a standard Dreadnought mounts a ranged weapon on one arm and a close combat weapon on the other, the Furioso replaces the ranged weapon with a second close combat arm, giving it devastating melee capability at the cost of long-range firepower. True Furioso Dreadnoughts, used by the Blood Angels, arm these weapons with specialized variants, known as Blood Fists and Blood Talons, massive hydraulic crushing weapons and razor-sharp slashing implements that can tear apart enemy infantry and vehicles alike with horrifying efficiency. Perhaps the most poignant Blood Angels Dreadnought variant is the Librarian Dreadnought. When a Blood Angels Librarian, one of the chapter's warrior psychers, is mortally wounded and interred within a Dreadnought, he retains his psychic abilities. The sarcophagus is modified with built-in psychic hoods and a force weapon, usually a force halberd, that allows the interred librarian to continue wielding his powers from within the armored shell of the Dreadnought. These are exceedingly rare machines, but their combination of psychic might and Dreadnought-scale firepower makes them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. They are also, one suspects, among the most tormented of all Dreadnought pilots, since the heightened psychic sensitivity that makes them valuable also makes them more acutely aware of their own isolation and suffering. The Space Wolves, the sons of Leman Russ, bring their own distinctive twist to Dreadnought technology, one that reflects the feral, Viking-inspired culture of their frozen homeworld of Fenris. As Space Wolves, Dreadnoughts are often referred to as the Old Ones or the Ancients, and they occupy a position of deep reverence within the chapter's cultural hierarchy. When the Space Wolves awaken a Dreadnought from stasis, it is treated as a significant event, with younger Marines gathering to hear the Ancient's tales of past battles and glean whatever wisdom they can from his millennia of experience. But the Space Wolves carry their own genetic curse, the Canis helix, a unique genetic element within their gene seed that gives them their enhanced senses, their feral instincts, and their connection to the spirit of the wolf. In rare cases, this genetic heritage can manifest in a condition known as the curse of the wolfen, a dramatic physical and mental transformation that reduces the affected warrior to a bestial state. Is something that is more wolf than man, driven by primal predatory instincts that override higher cognitive functions. Dreadnought interment does not prevent this transformation. In rare but documented cases, a warrior already sealed within a Dreadnought sarcophagus can succumb to the curse of the wolfen, his crippled body mutating even within the confines of his metal coffin, his mind deteriorating into something feral and savage. These wolfen Dreadnoughts are terrifying combatants, their weapon loadouts modified by the chapter's Iron Priests to replace ranged weapons with close combat implements, Fenrisian great axes and great wolf claws, since the beast within has no interest in anything as subtle as a ranged engagement. Some wolfen Dreadnoughts carry blizzard shields, powerful force field generators that allow them to absorb punishment as they charge headlong into the enemy, driven by instincts that know nothing of tactics or strategy, only the overwhelming imperative to kill. The most famous wolfen Dreadnought is the one known only as Murderfang, and his story is one of the most unsettling in all of Dreadnought lore. Murderfang was discovered in the year 960 of the 41st Millennium on a hellish world called Omnicide, where Logan Grimnar's great company stumbled upon a feral Dreadnought that was tearing its way through a force of Chaos Space Marines with no apparent regard for its own survival or anything resembling tactical coordination. It was simply killing, with a single-minded ferocity that defied any attempt at understanding or communication. After a fierce struggle, the Space Wolves managed to capture the machine and freeze it in stasis before transporting it back to the Fang, their fortress monastery on Fenris. But when they attempted to determine the identity of the warrior within, they found nothing. No records, no identification, no response to any attempt at communication. The identity of the once noble hero within the sarcophagus had been completely consumed by the bestial thing that now inhabited it. Whatever name he once bore, whatever deeds he once accomplished, whatever personality and memories he once possessed, all of it had been devoured by the curse of the wolfen, leaving behind nothing but a machine animated by pure, unreasoning savagery. The Space Wolves named it Murderfang and locked it in a glacial prison beneath the Fang, to be released only in times of the most desperate need. When Murderfang is unleashed, it does not fight in any recognizable strategic sense. It claws and stamps and tears until nothing is left but ruin, then continues to rage until the chapter's warriors can manage to freeze it again with Hellfrost technology. It is a force of nature encased in metal, and it represents, perhaps more than any other Dreadnought in the lore, the absolute worst-case scenario of what can happen when the genetic heritage of a chapter interacts with the already terrible reality of Dreadnought interment. The Dark Angels, another of the original first founding chapters, contribute their own specialized variant in the form of the Mortis Dreadnought. True to the Dark Angels' reputation for tactical versatility and their preference for balanced combined arms warfare, the Mortis mounts two ranged weapons rather than the standard combination of ranged and melee, making it a dedicated fire support platform. Commonly armed with paired twin-linked autocannons or twin-linked lascannons, the mortis can lay down a devastating volume of fire at range, suppressing enemy armor and providing covering fire for advancing infantry. The chapter's typical secretiveness means that detailed information about their dreadnoughts is harder to come by than for most other chapters, but we know that the Dark Angels maintain a significant number of these machines and deploy them with the careful, methodical precision that characterizes all of the chapter's military operations. The Grey Knights, the secretive chapter of demon-hunting space marines, whose very existence is known to only a handful of individuals within the Imperium, operate their own distinctive dreadnought variants. Grey Knights' dreadnoughts are unique in that they routinely house psykers, warriors whose psychic abilities are preserved through interment and can be wielded from within the sarcophagus. The Aegis dreadnought, used by the Grey Knights, is equipped with special warp-resistant devices and blessed armor that provides additional protection against psychic attacks and demonic powers. The Doomglaive dreadnought takes this even further, incorporating cyber circuitry into the sarcophagus that allows the interred warrior's psychic defenses to link with those of nearby Grey Knights, creating a network of reinforced psychic wards that is far stronger than what any individual warrior could project alone. And then there are the dreadnoughts of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, who occupy an entirely different tier of capability. The Custodes are to Space Marines what Space Marines are to ordinary humans, warriors of such extraordinary skill and genetic refinement that interring one of them within a dreadnought is a truly monumental undertaking. The Telemann Heavy Dreadnought, used exclusively by the Custodes, is a machine that towers over even the Contemptor, rivaling the Leviathan in sheer bulk, but crafted with an artisan's precision that reflects the extraordinary standards of the Golden Legion. Each Telemon reportedly bore at least one armor plate worked by the Emperor's own hand. And its weapons, the Arachnus Storm Cannon, the Iliastus Accelerator Culverin, and the Telemon Cyaestus, with its built-in plasma projector, are handcrafted masterpieces of lethal engineering that have no equivalent in any other faction's arsenal. The Custodes also field Contemptor variants that are unique to their order, including the Contemptor Galatus, which wields a massive sword and shield combination that makes it a fearsome defensive fighter, and the Contemptor Achilles, which carries a dreadspear, essentially a power spear scaled up to dreadnought proportions, capable of skewering even the heaviest enemy armor. These machines are exceedingly rare, and the honor of being interred within one is awarded only to the most celebrated warriors within the Custodes, and only when a worthy candidate has fallen in battle. Until then, the dreadnoughts stand silent and empty, waiting. We have talked about the technology. We have talked about the process. We have talked about the different patterns and variants. Now we need to talk about something that is, in many ways, more important than any of that. We need to talk about what it feels like to be inside one of these machines. We need to talk about the psychological reality of dreadnought existence, because this is where the true horror of the concept becomes apparent. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a space marine. You have spent centuries, perhaps 300 years, perhaps 500, perhaps more, fighting in the Emperor's name. You have your brothers, men you have fought beside and bled beside and watched die beside you. You have your chapter, an institution that has given your life meaning and purpose since the day you were chosen as a recruit. You have your body, that magnificent instrument of war that has been your constant companion since the gene seed was first implanted in your adolescent frame. Its strength and speed and resilience as much a part of your identity as your name. And then, in a single moment of violence, all of that is taken away. A plasma blast tears through your torso. A power claw rips your legs from your body. A Xenos bioweapon dissolves your organs from the inside out. Whatever the specific mechanism of your destruction, the result is the same. Your body, that temple of war that you have maintained and relied upon for centuries, is broken beyond repair. And instead of being allowed to die with honor, you are scooped up from the battlefield. As he packed in emergency stasis, and transported to a surgical facility where they cut away everything that no longer works and seal what is left inside a metal box. When you wake up, you are no longer you. Not in any meaningful sense. Your hands are gone, replaced by weapon mounts. Your eyes are gone, replaced by sensor arrays. Your voice is gone, replaced by crackling vox speakers that produce a synthetic approximation of speech that sounds nothing like the voice you remember. The air that used to fill your lungs is gone, replaced by cold, thick fluid that you must breathe in and out. An alien sensation that never quite becomes natural, no matter how many centuries you endure it. The warmth of human contact, the feeling of another person's hand on your shoulder, the sound of laughter shared around a fire after a successful campaign. All of these are gone, replaced by the cold, sterile feedback of mechanical sensors that can tell you the temperature and pressure of every surface you touch, but cannot convey what it actually feels like. You are alone in a way that no other living being in the Imperium is alone. Your brothers can see you, can talk to you through your vox speakers, can stand beside you on the battlefield, but they cannot reach you. You are sealed away behind layers of armor and ceramite and adamantium, floating in your cold fluid, connected to the world only through the artificial senses of the machine. They look up at you and see a hero, an ancient one, worthy of reverence. You look down at them and see faces that grow younger and less familiar with each passing century. This isolation is compounded by the way that dreadnoughts exist between battles. Unlike their brother Marines, who live in continuous community within the chapter, training together, eating together, praying together, maintaining the bonds of brotherhood that give their lives meaning and context, dreadnoughts are put to sleep. Between campaigns, when their services are not required, the chapter's tech marines power down the dreadnought systems and place the warrior in stasis, sealing him in the silence and darkness of suspended animation until the next time he is needed. This stasis is not restful. It is not the deep, restorative sleep that mortals experience when they close their eyes at night. Multiple sources in the lore describe it as something much more ambiguous and unsettling, and some accounts suggest that interred warriors do not truly lose consciousness during stasis, but instead enter a kind of half-aware liminal state, a dream world where memory and imagination blend together into experiences that are neither fully real nor fully imagined. In this state, the warrior may relive past battles, have conversations with other dreadnoughts who are similarly in stasis, or simply drift in a formless void that stretches subjectively for what feels like an eternity. When consciousness finally returns, it can be disorienting in the extreme, the warrior unsure of how much time has passed, unsure of what is real and what was dreamed, unsure if the experiences he remembers from his stasis were actual events or fabrications of a brain slowly deteriorating under conditions it was never meant to endure. Or the extended neural interface between a space marine and a vehicle as complex as a dreadnought creates immense mental stress on the occupant. Over time, this stress manifests as a range of psychological conditions that progressively erode the warrior's cognitive abilities and emotional stability. Lethargy sets in, a creeping reluctance to engage with the world that makes each awakening a little more difficult than the last. Confusion becomes more common, with the warrior struggling to distinguish between present reality and the accumulated memories and dreams of centuries. A condition called dyschronometria develops, a distortion of the warrior's sense of time that can make seconds feel like hours and centuries feel like moments. And in the worst cases, outright senility takes hold, reducing a once brilliant tactical mind to a fragmented and unreliable collection of disconnected memories and impulses. This progressive deterioration is one of the primary reasons that dreadnoughts are kept in stasis between battles rather than being allowed to remain active continuously. Stasis slows the degradation, preserving the warrior's mental faculties by reducing the amount of time his brain spends actively interfaced with the machine. But it does not stop the process entirely. With each awakening, the warrior loses a little more. Faces that were once sharp in memory become blurred and indistinct. Names that were once intimately familiar become just entries in a database. emotional connections that once gave meaning and warmth to his existence fade, replaced by the cold, analytical detachment of a mind that is slowly being consumed by the machine it inhabits. As some warriors resist this process with extraordinary determination. Through sheer force of will, they cling to their memories, their identities, their humanity, fighting the erosion with every awakening. Others accept it as inevitable, even welcome it as a mercy. If you can no longer remember what it felt like to be human, then perhaps the absence of human experience becomes easier to bear. If the faces of your brothers have faded from your memory, then perhaps their deaths, inevitable as they are for mortal warriors, cause you less pain. The lore provides us with a broad spectrum of how different dreadnoughts cope with their existence. At one end, you have warriors like Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves, who has maintained a remarkable degree of clarity and personality over 10,000 years of intermittent consciousness. His famous bitter humor and sharp tactical mind seemingly undiminished despite the passage of millennia. At the other end, you have cases like Murderfang, where the warrior's identity has been completely erased, replaced by something that bears no resemblance to the person who was originally interred. Between these extremes lies a vast range of experiences, from warriors who are essentially lucid but haunted, to those who drift in and out of coherence, to those who have become so detached from reality that they no longer understand where or when they are, fighting battles that ended centuries ago against enemies that no longer exist. The Warmonger, an ancient dreadnought of the Ultramarines, provides a particularly tragic example of this kind of temporal displacement. When awakened, the Warmonger believes himself to still be fighting during the Great Crusade on Terra, unable to comprehend or accept the reality of the 41st millennium. He must be carefully managed by his handlers, his confusion channeled toward the enemy in hopes that his formidable combat capabilities can be utilized despite his complete disconnection from the actual strategic situation. There is also the question of how the warrior perceives himself, which is a subtler but equally important aspect of the psychological reality. When a warrior first awakens in a dreadnought, he still thinks of himself as a person, a space marine who happens to be housed in an unusual body. But over time, as the organic components of his brain deteriorate and the mechanical aspects of his existence become increasingly dominant, this self-perception can shift. Some warriors gradually come to see themselves less as men wearing machines, and more as machines that happen to contain fragments of men. The tactical analysis becomes sharper, more precise, but the emotional context that once accompanied it fades away. The warrior can calculate optimal firing solutions with perfect accuracy, but can no longer remember why it matters. He can identify enemy weaknesses with mechanical precision, but can no longer feel the righteous fury that once drove him to exploit them. This gradual dehumanization is perhaps the most insidious aspect of long-term dreadnought existence. It does not happen all at once, but incrementally, almost imperceptibly, with each awakening bringing the warrior a tiny step further from what he was, and a tiny step closer to something else entirely. It is not death, and not in any conventional sense, but it is a kind of erasure, a slow dissolving of everything that once made the warrior who he was, until what remains is less a person, and more a very sophisticated weapons platform that occasionally remembers having been one. And the worst part, the truly terrible part, is that many warriors are aware of this happening. They can feel themselves slipping away, century by century, awakening by awakening. They can look back at memories from earlier in their internment and recognize how much sharper, how much more vivid, how much more human those memories are compared to their current experience. They know what is happening to them, and they are powerless to stop it. They can fight it, yes, and some do, with a stubbornness that is deeply admirable. But the machine is patient, and the millennia are long, and in the end the machine always wins. Unless, of course, death comes first. And for some warriors, death is not the enemy they were taught to fight, but the mercy they have been silently praying for since the moment they first awoke in their metal coffin. There is one more dimension of the dreadnought experience that we should explore before moving on to the stories of the famous warriors who have inhabited these machines, and that is the concept of the machine spirit. In the theology of the Adeptus Mechanicus, every sufficiently complex machine possesses a machine spirit, a semi-sentient presence that inhabits the mechanical systems and influences their function. The machine spirit is not an artificial intelligence in the conventional sense. It is something more akin to a mechanical personality, and a set of tendencies and behaviors that emerge from the complexity of the machine's systems and that must be understood, respected, and appeased by those who maintain and operate it. For a dreadnought, the machine spirit takes on a significance that goes far beyond what it represents in a tank or a starship. Because a dreadnought's machine spirit coexists with a living consciousness, sharing the same mechanical body, influencing and being influenced by the organic mind that has been wired into its systems. The relationship between the warrior's consciousness and the machine spirit is one of the least understood aspects of dreadnought technology, but the scattered references in the lore suggest that it is complex, intimate, and not always harmonious. Some warriors describe the machine spirit as a presence that they can feel at the edges of their awareness, a will that is not their own, but that is not entirely separate from them either. It is there when they move the dreadnought's limbs, a subtle resistance or cooperation that colors every action. It is there when they fire the weapons, a mechanical eagerness or reluctance that can affect timing and accuracy in ways that no amount of targeting software can fully account for. It is there in the quiet moments between battles, a low hum of awareness that fills the silence of the sarcophagus with something that is not quite companionship, but is better than nothing. The machine spirit of a dreadnought, with a long history of service, is said to carry echoes of its previous occupants, as impressions and tendencies that reflect the personalities of the warriors who inhabited the chassis before the current occupant took his place. A dreadnought that previously housed a fierce and aggressive warrior may exhibit a tendency toward aggressive behavior, even after a new, more cautious warrior has been interred. A dreadnought that was previously piloted by a strategic thinker may seem to anticipate tactical situations with an acuity that exceeds what the current occupant's experience alone could account for. These echoes are not ghosts in any literal sense, but they represent something that the Mechanicus considers sacred: the accumulated wisdom and experience of the machine, preserved in the patterns of its systems and available to those who know how to listen. For the warrior inside, was learning to work with the machine spirit rather than against it is an essential part of the adaptation process. Those who resist the machine spirit, who try to impose their will on the dreadnought without acknowledging the machine's own tendencies and preferences, often find their experience more difficult than it needs to be. The machine fights them at every turn. Its response is sluggish, its weapons bulky, its movements awkward and imprecise. Those who learn to cooperate with the machine spirit, to treat it as a partner rather than a tool, find that the dreadnought becomes more responsive, more intuitive, more capable of the kind of fluid, instinctive combat that distinguishes a truly effective war machine from one that merely goes through the motions. This cooperation is not always easy. The machine spirit has its own priorities, has its own way of processing the world, and these do not always align with what the warrior wants or needs. There are accounts of dreadnoughts whose machine spirits have become so dominant that the warrior inside struggles to maintain control, his own will subordinated to the mechanical imperatives of a system that sees the battlefield purely in terms of threat assessment and optimal weapons deployment. In these cases, the warrior may find himself firing on targets that he would not have chosen, moving in directions that he did not intend, responding to stimuli in ways that reflect the machine's programming rather than his own judgment. The line between piloting the dreadnought and being piloted by it can become blurred, and in extreme cases, the warrior may lose the ability to distinguish his own thoughts from those of the machine entirely. And this is, according to some accounts in the lore, one of the mechanisms by which long-term interment erodes the warrior's identity. It is not just the passage of time, and the degradation of organic brain tissue that wears away the self. It is the constant, intimate coexistence with a non-human intelligence that gradually reshapes the warrior's thought patterns, his decision-making processes, his very sense of who and what he is. The machine spirit is patient. It does not need to overpower the warrior's consciousness in any dramatic sense. It simply needs to be there, day after day, century after century, a constant presence that subtly but inexorably shifts the balance between the man and the machine until the distinction between them no longer has any practical meaning. Whether this represents a form of death, emerging, or something else entirely is a question that the law deliberately leaves open. The Mechanicus would argue that it is a form of transcendence, the warrior ascending from the limitations of flesh to become one with the sacred machine. The chaplains would argue that it is a form of sacrifice, the warrior's individual identity being consumed in service to a greater purpose. And the warrior himself, if he could still articulate such complex thoughts, might argue that it is simply the way things are. The machine is his body, the machine spirit is his companion, and together they walk the battlefields of the far future, two consciousnesses sharing a single shell, until the day when the reactor finally goes cold and the silence of the deep halls claims them both. The battlefield deployment of a dreadnought is an event of considerable significance for the Space Marines who fight alongside one. For many younger Marines, it is their first direct encounter with one of the chapter's ancients, a living piece of their chapter's history walking among them, and the psychological impact can be profound. The presence of a dreadnought on the battlefield boosts morale in a way that few other assets can match, not through any mechanical means, but simply through what the machine represents. A hero who endured, who sacrificed everything and kept fighting, who embodies the very ideals that every Space Marine aspires to uphold. The warriors who fight alongside a dreadnought quickly learn to adapt their tactics to accommodate its presence. The dreadnought's massive frame, yet while an asset in terms of firepower and durability, can also be a liability in confined spaces. Its weapon systems, while devastatingly effective, can cause significant collateral damage to nearby friendly forces if the targeting is not carefully controlled. Its movement patterns, while surprisingly agile for its size, are nevertheless different from those of infantry and must be accounted for in any tactical plan. Experienced sergeants learn to use the dreadnought as a mobile anchor point, positioning their squads to take advantage of the covering fire it provides while staying clear of its most dangerous firing arcs. In melee combat, the dreadnought is both shield and sword for the Marines around it. Its armored bulk absorbs enemy fire that would shred infantry, and its power fist or close combat weapon can dispatch threats that would take an entire squad to bring down. But it is also vulnerable in ways that are not immediately obvious. Despite its formidable armor, a dreadnought can be overwhelmed by a sufficiently determined enemy, particularly one equipped with specialized anti-armor weapons or the kind of psychic or demonic powers that can bypass physical protection entirely. When a dreadnought falls in battle, the Marines around it respond with a ferocity that goes beyond normal combat doctrine. They will fight to the death to recover the fallen ancient, not just out of reverence for the warrior inside, but because the chassis itself is an irreplaceable piece of their chapter's heritage that must not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Yet the recovery of a damaged or destroyed dreadnought from the battlefield is a priority that often shapes the entire tactical plan for an engagement. Special recovery teams, usually led by tech Marines and supported by dedicated security elements, are assigned the task of extracting the dreadnought if it is disabled. In some cases, the recovery of a fallen dreadnought has been the primary objective of entire operations, with hundreds of Marines committing to battle, specifically to create the conditions necessary for the extraction team to reach the downed machine and remove it to safety. If the warrior inside is still alive, the urgency is even greater. Every moment that passes increases the risk that his life support systems will fail, that some secondary injury will finish what the enemy's weapons began. That the spark of consciousness that animates the machine will finally be extinguished. The tech marines who specialize in Dreadnought recovery are among the most skilled and experienced in their discipline, capable of performing emergency repairs and life support stabilization under combat conditions that would challenge even the most capable of their peers. Their work is as much art as science, a combination of technical knowledge, intuitive understanding of the machine, and a deep respect for the warrior within that guides every decision they make. When a dreadnought is destroyed beyond recovery, when the sarcophagus is breached, and the warrior inside is finally, irrevocably dead, the chapter mourns. Funeral rites are conducted with all the ceremony due to a hero of the ancient stature, and his name is added to the chapter's rolls of honor alongside all the other warriors who have given their lives in the Emperor's service. But the loss of a dreadnought carries an additional weight that the loss of a standard battle brother, however tragic, does not. Because the dreadnought was not just a warrior. He was a piece of living history, a bridge to the past, a repository of centuries or millennia of accumulated experience and wisdom that can never be replaced. When a dreadnought dies, a chapter does not just lose a fighter, it loses a part of its soul. There is a detail about dreadnought deployment that often gets overlooked in broader discussions of the subject, and it is one of those small things that, once you become aware of it, adds an entire new dimension of tragedy to the concept. When a dreadnought is deployed to a war zone, he typically arrives in the company of space marines who are strangers to him. The brothers he knew, the warriors he fought beside in his previous life, the faces that populated his world before the sarcophagus closed around him. Those men are dead. They died decades or centuries or millennia ago, their gene seed harvested and implanted in new recruits who grew up hearing stories about the Ancient One in the deep halls, but who never knew him as a person. The warriors who load him into the drop pod, who check his weapon systems and murmur prayers over his ammunition feeds, who stand beside him as the transport screams through atmosphere, are children by his reckoning. They were born, recruited, implanted, trained and blooded while he slept, and they will grow old in his service and die while he sleeps again. Every awakening is, in a very real sense, a fresh bereavement. The chapter endures, its traditions and identity preserved across the generations, but the individuals who compose it are constantly changing, replaced by new faces that the dreadnought will barely have time to learn before they too pass into the chapter's history. Imagine waking up every few decades to find that everyone you knew is gone, and everyone around you is new, that the world has changed in ways both subtle and dramatic, that references you make to shared experiences are met with blank looks, because nobody alive remembers the events you are referring to. Now imagine that happening not once, not twice, but dozens of times across a span of centuries that stretches your sense of personal continuity to the breaking point and beyond. Some chapters try to mitigate this through the practice of assigning specific marines to serve as the dreadnought's handlers or attendants, warriors who are responsible for briefing the ancient upon awakening, managing his integration into the current force structure, and serving as a familiar point of contact during deployments. Over time, these handlers can develop genuine relationships with the interred warrior, relationships that provide a thread of personal continuity across the otherwise disorienting cycle of sleep and waking. But even these relationships are temporary, limited by the handler's own mortal span, and when they end, as the dreadnought must begin the process of forming new connections all over again. The chaplains of each chapter also play a significant role in this process. As the keepers of the chapter's spiritual health and the guardians of its traditions, chaplains are often the ones who spend the most time communicating with dreadnoughts during their periods of wakefulness. They listen to the ancient stories, validate his experiences, and help him find meaning in his continued service. For some dreadnoughts, the chaplain may be the closest thing to a friend they have, the one person who takes the time to speak to them, not as a revered relic or a weapon system, but as a brother. The loss of a particularly sympathetic chaplain can hit a dreadnought harder than the loss of an entire company, because it means losing the one relationship that provided emotional sustenance in an existence otherwise defined by isolation. There is also the matter of how dreadnoughts interact with each other, a dynamic that is more complex and more interesting than it might initially appear. In chapters that maintain multiple active dreadnoughts, the interred warriors sometimes have the opportunity to communicate with one another through vox networks that connect their sarcophagi within the stasis halls. These conversations, carried out through crackling mechanical voices in the cold darkness between battles, represent one of the few forms of genuine peer interaction available to interred warriors. Only another dreadnought can truly understand what it is like to be a dreadnought, and the bonds that form between these warriors. But while necessarily constrained by the limitations of their mechanical existence, can be profound. Some of the most poignant exchanges in the lore occur between dreadnoughts of vastly different ages, where a relatively newly interred warrior seeks guidance from one who has been entombed for centuries. The elder may counsel the younger to forget his mortal concerns, to release his attachment to the human memories and emotions that will only cause him pain as they inevitably fade. Others may counsel the opposite, urging the younger warrior to cling to his humanity with everything he has, to fight the erosion of identity with the same ferocity he brings to the battlefield. The advice varies, but the underlying dynamic is always the same. Two beings who are uniquely positioned to understand each other's suffering, reaching across the cold distance of their metal shells to offer whatever comfort they can. And then there are the times when one of these voices falls silent, when a dreadnought's life support finally fails, or when the warrior within simply stops responding. The other dreadnoughts in the hall notice the hum of a neighbor's sarcophagus, the faint crackle of his vox frequency, the presence that has been a constant companion through the long darkness of stasis, all of it suddenly gone, replaced by a silence that speaks volumes about the fragility of even this seemingly immortal form of existence. The surviving dreadnoughts mourn in their own way, which may look like nothing from the outside, a slight fluctuation in neural activity. It's a brief spike in emotional response that the monitoring systems register and flag for the tech marine's attention, but which represents, for the warrior experiencing it, a grief as real and as sharp as anything felt by a being of flesh and blood. Let us return for a moment to the Horus Heresy, because the impact of that galaxy-spanning civil war on the Dreadnought program cannot be overstated, and there are details we have not yet fully explored. During the Great Crusade, each of the 20 Space Marine legions maintained its own force of dreadnoughts, warriors who had fallen in the Emperor's wars and been preserved in iron to continue their service. The exact number varied from legion to legion based on factors like attrition rate, tactical doctrine, and the availability of chassis. But even conservative estimates suggest that there were hundreds of active dreadnoughts spread across the legions at the time of the heresy's outbreak. These were not just weapons, they were living repositories of the Crusade's history, warriors who remembered the early campaigns, who had fought alongside the Primarchs in their first battles, who carried within them the institutional memory of legions that were, at that point, less than 3 centuries old. When the betrayal came, these venerable warriors were forced to choose sides along with the rest of their legions. For the Loyalists, this meant continuing to serve the Emperor as they always had, though now against former brothers rather than alien enemies. For the traitors, it meant turning against everything they had sworn to protect. Though many of the interred warriors on the traitor side did not do so willingly, some had been manipulated by their Primarchs, their loyalty to their gene father overriding their loyalty to the Emperor. Others had been corrupted by the warp, their long exposure to the Imperium through the various campaigns of the Crusade having weakened their resistance to its blandishments. And some simply had no choice, sealed inside machines that were controlled by tech adepts loyal to the traitor cause, unable to resist or refuse when the order came to turn their guns on brothers they had fought beside for decades. The battles of the heresy produced dreadnought on dreadnought combat on a scale that had never been seen before and has never been seen since. The Siege of Terror, the final and most catastrophic engagement of the Civil War, while I saw dreadnoughts of both factions clashing in the corridors and plazas of the Imperial Palace, their weapons tearing through the very architecture that they had been built to protect. The sound of these engagements, the thunder of assault cannons and the screech of power fists against ceramite, echoed through halls that had been built by the Emperor's own hands, and the blood that was spilled there, both real and mechanical, soaked into stones that would bear the stains for 10,000 years. For the dreadnoughts who survived the heresy, the aftermath was in many ways more difficult than the war itself. The loyalist dreadnoughts, who endured the siege of Terra, found themselves in a galaxy that had been fundamentally transformed. The Emperor was interred upon the Golden Throne. The Primarchs were dead, missing, or transformed beyond recognition. The legions were being broken up into smaller chapters. The technologies that had built and maintained their sophisticated chassis were being lost. Everything they had known, everything they had fought for, had changed, and they were left to adapt to a new reality while sealed inside machines that connected them to a past that no longer existed. The traitor dreadnoughts, who survived the heresy, faced a different but equally terrible fate. Dragged into the Eye of Terror with the rest of the traitor forces, they were cut off from the resources and knowledge that had sustained them, exposed to the corrupting influence of the warp without the protection of stasis technology, and frequently subjected to the casual cruelty of masters who no longer valued their service. Over the millennia that followed, these warriors devolved into the screaming, thrashing horrors that we know as hellbrutes, their consciousness buried so deep beneath layers of madness and mutation that the original warrior is, for all practical purposes, gone. Among the other famous dreadnoughts, whose stories deserve attention, Brother Tancred of the Black Templars holds a special place in the lore. The Black Templars are a chapter obsessed with crusading, spending their entire existence on permanent campaign rather than maintaining a fixed home world. Their dreadnoughts are, if anything, even more revered than those of other chapters because they represent a direct link to the chapter's founding and its earliest crusades. Tancred's story is notable for the way it illustrates the psychological impact of long-term interment on a warrior who was already famously driven and aggressive in his mortal life. Even before his interment, Tancred was known for his fierce devotion to the chapter's creed of perpetual war against the enemies of the Emperor. As a dreadnought, this devotion has been distilled into something even more intense, a burning, single-minded focus on combat that leaves room for little else. When Tancred is awakened, his first and often only concern is the enemy and how best to destroy them. The gentler aspects of his personality, whatever they might have been worn away by centuries of cycling between combat and stasis, leaving behind a warrior who is supremely effective on the battlefield, but who has sacrificed much of what made him a person in the process. The Black Templars' approach to their dreadnoughts reflects the chapter's broader culture, one that glorifies martial prowess above all other virtues, and views the suffering of dreadnought interment not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a crucible that burns away everything that is not essential to the warrior's purpose. In this view, the loss of personality, the fading of memories, the gradual dissolution of individual identity are not things to be fought against, but to be embraced as a form of spiritual refinement, a purging of worldly attachments that brings the warrior closer to the Emperor's ideal of perfect, selfless service. Whether the warriors inside the sarcophagi share this view is, so of course, a question that the chapter's culture does not encourage anyone to ask. Brother Davian Thula of the Blood Ravens provides a rather different example. Familiar to many through his appearance in the Dawn of War video game series, Thule was a company captain who was fatally poisoned by Tyranid bioweapons during the Aurelian Crusades. The poison was burning through his veins, destroying his organs one by one. And the only way to save his life was to place him within a dreadnought sarcophagus before the toxin could reach his brain. The urgency of the situation meant that the normal rituals and preparations were abbreviated, and Thule awoke in his new form, with a degree of confusion and disorientation that was even more pronounced than usual for newly interred warriors. What makes Thula's story interesting from a lore perspective is the documented improvement in his condition over time. Early in his interment, Thula was barely coherent, struggling to string words together and frequently losing track of conversations. His speech was halting and stilted, his responses delayed, his personality seemingly muted to the point of near absence. But as time passed and he fought more battles, he gradually became more lucid, more capable of sustained thought and complex communication. This suggests that for at least some warriors, the initial trauma of interment is not necessarily permanent, and that the brain's remarkable capacity for adaptation, enhanced by the Space Marine's genetically augmented neural architecture, can compensate at least partially for the shock of the transition. Whether this improvement continues indefinitely or simply represents an adjustment period before the longer-term deterioration sets in is unclear from the available lore. The last known reports of Thula's status are ambiguous. He was last seen engaging in combat as a planet-destroying exterminatus action began around him, and his current condition is unknown. But his story offers a rare note of cautious optimism in an otherwise relentlessly grim narrative, suggesting that the initial horror of Dreadnought awakening is not necessarily the final word on the experience. The Iron Hands, that chapter whose fetishistic devotion to mechanical augmentation makes them uniquely suited, culturally if not psychologically, to the realities of Dreadnought interment, provide yet another perspective. For the sons of Ferrus Manus, the replacement of weak flesh with strong iron is not a tragedy, but a blessing, a step along the path toward the mechanical perfection that the chapter pursues with religious intensity. Iron Hands dreadnoughts are maintained with particular care and reverence, and the warriors within them are consulted on matters of chapter governance and policy with an regularity that exceeds what most other chapters afford their interred heroes. The Iron Hands Clan Council, the ruling body of the chapter, has historically included dreadnoughts among its members. The venerable dreadnought Banus, for instance, became a clan leader of Clan Cargill and held a seat on the clan council, exercising political influence and strategic authority from within his metal shell. As this level of continued integration into the chapter's power structure is unusual among Space Marine chapters and reflects the Iron Hands' belief that the transition from flesh to machine is not a diminishment, but an elevation. But even among the Iron Hands, the reality of Dreadnought interment is not as clean or as comfortable as their philosophy might suggest. The chapter's emphasis on the superiority of the mechanical over the organic can, in extreme cases, lead to an attitude that is dismissive of the psychological suffering experienced by interred warriors. If flesh is weak and iron is strong, then the emotional distress caused by the loss of one's physical body is simply another weakness to be overcome, another flaw of the flesh to be purged in pursuit of mechanical perfection. This attitude, while philosophically consistent, can be deeply harmful to warriors who are struggling with the reality of their transformation and who need compassion rather than admonishment. There is one more story that I want to tell before we close, because it illustrates something essential about the Dreadnought experience that all of the technical details and historical analysis in the world cannot quite capture. It is the story of the Cassian Dracos, a unique dreadnought of the Salamanders chapter, whose origins reach back to the Great Crusade itself. Cassian Vaughan was one of the oldest Marines in the 18th Legion during the Crusade and the Heresy, a warrior of such renown and importance that when he was mortally wounded, the Salamander's Primarch Vulcan personally undertook to forge a dreadnought sarcophagus for him. Think about that for a moment. The Primarch, after being of godlike power and skill, took time in the middle of a galaxy-spanning military campaign to handcraft a coffin for one of his fallen sons. The resulting sarcophagus, called the Draco's Revenant, was described as a unique work of unsurpassed sophistication and resilience, a masterpiece of the forge that reflected Vulcan's love for his sons as much as his skill as a craftsman. Vaughan fought in the Dreadnought through some of the most terrible battles of the Heresy, including the drop site massacre at Istvan V, where 3 loyal legions were ambushed and nearly destroyed by the combined forces of the traitors. He fell in that battle, but his dreadnought was recovered, and the Draco's revenant went on to serve new occupants in the millennia that followed, at each one inheriting not just the machine, but the legacy of the warrior who had worn it first. This is a detail that often gets lost in discussions of dreadnoughts. The machine outlasts the man. A dreadnought chassis can serve for thousands of years, housing a succession of fallen heroes who each bring their own personality, their own experiences, their own relationship with the machine to the partnership. When a warrior finally dies within the sarcophagus, truly dies, the chassis is cleaned and reconsecrated and prepared for its next occupant. A new name is inscribed on the honor scroll. A new consciousness is wired into the neural interface. And the machine walks again, carrying within it the accumulated spiritual weight of every warrior who has ever inhabited its shell. For the new occupant, inheriting a dreadnought with a long and distinguished history can be both an honor and a burden. He is expected to uphold the legacy of those who came before him, to fight with the same distinction that earned the chassis its reputation, to add his own name to a roll of heroes that may stretch back to the founding of his chapter. He is, in a sense, not just becoming a dreadnought, but joining a lineage, becoming the latest in a line of warriors who have shared the same metal body across the centuries. This concept of the shared chassis adds another layer to the dreadnought experience that distinguishes it from almost any other form of military service in the Imperium. The warrior is not just fighting for his chapter and his emperor. He is fighting for the name inscribed on his armor, just for the legacy of every warrior who bore that name before him, for the machine spirit that has witnessed centuries of war and carries within its mechanical memory echoes of battles and warriors that no living being remembers. It is, in the end, a form of immortality, just not the kind that anyone would choose. The man dies, eventually, as all men must. But the machine endures, and in the machine, something of the man persists, not as a consciousness or a personality, but as a legacy, a set of battle honors and campaign markers and sacred traditions that are carried forward by the next warrior to inhabit the shell. It is immortality of a sort, the kind that the Imperium specializes in, vast, impersonal, and utterly indifferent to the individual human lives that make it possible. The dreadnoughts walk, and the galaxy burns around them. And the war goes on, as it has for 10,000 years, and will for 10,000 more. Somewhere in the darkness of a stasis vault, an ancient is sleeping, his consciousness suspended in cold fluid, his body reduced to a collection of failing organic components that even the finest tech priests in the Imperium cannot restore. He is waiting for the next war, the next awakening, the next brief span of violent consciousness before the darkness claims him again. He does not know when it will come. He may not even know who he is anymore. But when the alarm sounds and the tech marines begin the ritual of activation, when the reactor hums to life and the weapon systems charge and the targeting arrays snap into focus, he will be ready. Because that is what a dreadnought is. Ready, always ready, for the Emperor, for the chapter, or for the brothers he can no longer remember, and the duty he can never forget. That is the final truth. That is the cost, and that is the glory, such as it is, of what it takes to become a dreadnought in the 41st millennium. Before we move on to the famous warriors who have worn these metal shells, there is something else we need to explore in depth. We need to talk about what happens when a dreadnought actually goes to war, because the experience of combat from inside one of these machines is a subject that the lore handles with surprising nuance, and it reveals truths about the dreadnought experience that no amount of discussion about technology and surgery can adequately convey. The awakening ritual varies from chapter to chapter, but in most cases, it follows a broadly similar pattern. That the dreadnought's stasis vault is located deep within the fortress monastery. in halls that are kept cold and silent, maintained by servitors and monitored by tech marines who check the life support readings at regular intervals. When the chapter's leadership determines that a dreadnought must be roused for battle, the process begins with a series of prayers and rites conducted by the chapter's chaplains, asking the machine spirit's permission to disturb its charge and beseeching the Emperor for his blessing on the awakening. The tech marines then begin the technical process of bringing the dreadnought systems online. This is not a matter of flipping a switch. The reactor must be slowly brought up to operating temperature. The neural interface must be recalibrated and tested. The weapon systems must be charged and verified. But the locomotion systems must be powered up and tested for full range of motion. Amniotic fluid composition must be checked and adjusted. Life support parameters must be confirmed. Sensory systems must be activated and calibrated. Communication equipment must be tested. The process can take hours, sometimes days, depending on how long the dreadnought has been in stasis and the condition of its various systems. And then, somewhere in the middle of all this mechanical preparation, there is a moment that every tech marine dreads and every chaplain prays over, the moment when the interred warrior's consciousness begins to surface. This is the point at which the technical process becomes a deeply personal one, because the being waking up inside the machine is not a component or a system. He is a person, or at least what remains of one. And the process of waking from the kind of stasis that dreadnoughts experience is nothing like waking from natural sleep. The warrior often surfaces confused, disoriented, uncertain of where or when he is. Some awake screaming, trapped in the echo of whatever dream or nightmare occupied their stasis. Others awake slowly, their consciousness swimming up through layers of fog and darkness like a diver ascending from deep water. Some immediately begin asking about the tactical situation, their warrior instincts asserting themselves before their personal identity has fully re-engaged. Others ask about brothers who have been dead for centuries, not yet aware that they have been asleep for longer than a normal human lifetime. The chaplains play a crucial role during this period, providing spiritual guidance and emotional grounding as the warrior reorients himself. They remind the ancient of his name, his chapter, his duty, his honor. They bring him up to speed on what has happened during his sleep, though this is often done selectively, as the full weight of everything that has changed can be overwhelming. They pray with him, invoke the Emperor's protection over him, and help him transition from the disoriented, vulnerable state of initial awakening to the focused, purposeful state required for combat. Once the dreadnought is fully operational and its occupant has been briefed on the current situation, the war machine is moved to wherever it is needed. For planetary deployments, this often means being loaded into a drop pod, a specially designed variant large enough to accommodate the dreadnought's bulk, and launched from orbit to the planet's surface in a ballistic descent that slams the machine into the ground like a ceramite meteor. For void engagements, the dreadnought might be deployed through the corridors of a boarding torpedo, or positioned within a starship's internal compartments to defend against enemy boarding actions. In either case, the transition from the quiet of the stasis vault to the chaos of the battlefield is abrupt and disorienting, and the warrior inside must adapt immediately. The experience of combat inside a dreadnought is described by those few warriors who have shared their thoughts on the matter as simultaneously exhilarating and empty. The exhilaration comes from the sheer power that the machine provides. Where once the warrior wielded a bolter or a chainsword, when he now commands weapons that can level buildings and shatter armored vehicles. Where once he could be felled by a well-placed shot or a lucky blow, he now shrugs off weapons fire that would annihilate his former power-armored body. Where once he advanced at the pace of infantry, he now strides across the battlefield with a ground-shaking tread that makes the earth tremble beneath him. For a warrior bred for combat, engineered for war at the very core of his being, this kind of power can be intoxicating, especially in the first moments of an engagement when the adrenaline, or whatever neurochemical equivalent his ravaged endocrine system still produces, begins to flow. But the emptiness follows close behind. because the combat is experienced differently when it is filtered through mechanical senses rather than organic ones. But the warrior sees the enemy through optical sensors that paint the world in data overlays and targeting reticles, not through eyes that register light and color and the subtle visual cues that a living creature uses to read the emotional state of those around him. He hears the clash of weapons through audio pickups that process sound as waveform data, stripped of the visceral immediacy that makes battle sound like battle rather than like an abstract technical readout. He feels the impact of his weapons through force feedback systems that tell him the magnitude and direction of each blow, but cannot convey the primal satisfaction of a physical act of destruction performed with one's own muscles and sinews. The result is a strange dissociation, a sense of fighting at one remove from the actual experience of fighting. The warrior is present on the battlefield, engaged with the enemy, performing acts of devastating violence, but he is doing so through a filter that strips away the emotional and sensory richness that gives combat its meaning. For a space marine who has been bred and trained and conditioned for war above all other purposes, this removal from the full experience of battle is a profound loss. Combat was the thing that gave his existence meaning, the arena in which he expressed everything he was and everything he aspired to be. And now, even that has been taken from him. He can still fight. He can fight more destructively than ever before, but the fighting itself has become hollow, mechanical in every sense of the word, a process rather than an experience. This is not universally true, of course, as some warriors report moments of genuine connection during combat, flashes of emotion that break through the mechanical detachment and remind them of what it felt like to be truly alive. These moments are typically associated with situations of extreme intensity, a desperate last stand, a duel with a worthy opponent, a moment of unexpected grace amid the carnage, when the warrior's consciousness is so fully engaged with the present moment that the barrier between his organic self and his mechanical shell briefly dissolves. These moments are treasured by the warriors who experience them, held onto and remembered long after the battle has ended, because they represent proof that something human still survives within the machine. After the battle is won or lost, the Dreadnought faces another transition that is, in its own way, and as difficult as the awakening. The fighting is over. The purpose that justified his existence for the past hours or days or weeks has been fulfilled, and now he must be returned to the stasis vault, powered down, and sealed away in the darkness, until the next time the chapter has need of his services. This moment, the moment of returning to sleep, is described by many interred warriors as the hardest part of their existence. Not the fighting, not the injury, not the surgery, not even the initial shock of awakening in a metal body. The hardest part is the moment when the fighting stops and the silence begins, when the warrior must face the prospect of slipping back into the void, knowing that when he returns, the world will have moved on without him, that faces he has just begun to recognize will have aged or died, show that the tactical situation will have changed in ways he cannot predict, and that another small piece of who he was will have been worn away by the passage of time. Some warriors face this moment with stoic acceptance. They are space marines after all, and acceptance of hardship is woven into every fiber of their being. Others resist it, requesting to remain active for longer than is strictly necessary, finding excuses to delay the return to stasis. Some chapters accommodate these requests within reason, understanding the psychological value of allowing the warrior a brief period of wakefulness beyond the immediate demands of combat. The Space Wolves, for instance, traditionally keep their dreadnoughts awake for a time after each deployment, allowing them to share meals and stories with the chapter's battle brothers, preserving the bonds of community that give Dreadnought existence, whatever meaning it still possesses. But eventually, the stasis must come. The neural interface takes its toll on the organic brain, and extended wakefulness accelerates the deterioration that all interred warriors eventually face. The Tech Marines, guided by their monitoring of the warrior's neural activity and vital signs, make the determination that it is time, and the process of powering down begins. The warrior's consciousness dims. The mechanical senses fade. The world contracts from the vast, data-rich panorama of the Dreadnought's sensor suite to a narrowing tunnel of awareness that shrinks and shrinks until there is nothing left but darkness. And in that darkness, the warrior sleeps and waits. And if any part of him is still aware enough to do so, but hopes that the next awakening will come before the last of who he is has been quietly consumed by the machine. There is another aspect of Dreadnought existence that deserves extended attention, and that is the relationship between the interred warrior and the tech marines who maintain his mechanical body. This relationship is one of the most complex and emotionally charged dynamics in Space Marine culture, and it plays a crucial role in determining the quality of a Dreadnought's existence. Tech Marines occupy a peculiar position within Space Marine chapters. They are fully initiated battle brothers who have received additional training from the Adeptus Mechanicus on Mars, learning the sacred arts of machine maintenance and construction. This dual allegiance to both their chapter and the Mechanicus, it gives them a perspective that is unique among Space Marines. They understand machines in a way that other battle brothers do not, and they view the relationship between flesh and metal through a lens that is influenced by the Mechanicus's quasi-religious reverence for technology. For a tech marine responsible for maintaining a dreadnought, his charge is simultaneously a piece of sacred machinery and a brother warrior. These two identities can be difficult to reconcile, particularly when the demands of one conflict with the demands of the other. The machine requires regular maintenance, calibration, and repair, procedures that can be invasive and uncomfortable for the organic being inside. The warrior requires psychological support, social interaction, and a sense of purpose, as needs that the machine is not designed to fulfill and that may conflict with the technical requirements for optimal system performance. A good tech marine navigates this tension with sensitivity and skill, treating the dreadnought as a whole being rather than as a set of separate mechanical and biological components. He maintains the machine's systems with the same devotion that a knight would show to his lord's armor, but he also makes time to speak with the warrior inside, to listen to his concerns, to address his psychological needs as far as is possible within the constraints of the situation. He monitors the warrior's neural activity not just for signs of mechanical malfunction, but for signs of emotional distress, intervening when the warrior's mental state threatens to deteriorate beyond recovery. A poor tech marine, or one who has been too heavily influenced by the Mechanicus's tendency to view biological components as interchangeable parts, can make a dreadnought's existence significantly worse. When the tech priests of Mars designed the Redemptor dreadnought, for instance, they treated the interred warrior as, in their own words, little more than another part to be interred or replaced as necessary. This attitude, while shocking to those who view the warriors within as individuals deserving of care and respect, is not uncommon among the more zealously machine-focused elements of the Mechanicus. For these individuals, the sarcophagus is merely a component of the machine, and the organic being within it is simply a biological interface that will eventually wear out and need to be replaced. That no different in principle from a corroded servo or a depleted power cell. The tension between these two perspectives, the humanistic view that sees the warrior as a person to be cared for, and the mechanistic view that sees him as a component to be maintained, runs through the entire history of dreadnought technology and colors every aspect of the experience. Chapters that lean toward the former perspective tend to produce dreadnoughts that retain their sanity and identity for longer, while those that lean toward the latter tend to see faster deterioration and more extreme cases of mental breakdown. This is not merely a matter of technical proficiency. It is a matter of whether the warrior inside the machine is treated as a brother or as a battery. The tech marines also serve as the primary point of contact between the interred warrior and the outside world. When a dreadnought speaks, it is through vox speakers that produce a synthetic approximation of the warrior's voice. A crackling, mechanical sound that bears only the faintest resemblance to the voice the warrior once had. The Dreadnought systems translate the warrior's thoughts and emotions into this simulated vocalization, but the translation is imperfect. Nuances of tone and inflection that a flesh voice would convey naturally must be interpreted and approximated by the machine, resulting in speech that can sound oddly flat or disconnected, even when the warrior is experiencing intense emotion. One particularly haunting detail from the lore is the observation that the machine might translate a dreadnought's laughter into the cycling of autocannon rounds, a mechanical approximation of a human expression that underscores just how thoroughly the interface transforms even the most basic forms of communication. For the tech marines who work closely with these machines, learning to read the subtle cues that indicate the warrior's true emotional state beneath the mechanical overlay is a skill that takes decades to develop. An experienced tech marine can tell when a dreadnought is distressed, even when its vox output sounds perfectly calm. He can detect the faint fluctuations in neural activity that indicate the warrior is struggling with his confinement. He can sense when the machine spirit is agitated, when the reactor is running hot, yet when the amniotic fluid needs adjustment, when the input cords are causing discomfort. These subtle readings, invisible to anyone who does not know what to look for, form the basis of a relationship that is as intimate, in its own way, as any brotherhood shared between battle brothers who fight side by side. Some tech marines develop deep bonds with the dreadnoughts in their care, bonds that span decades or even centuries as the tech marine ages and serves, while the dreadnought sleeps and wakes and sleeps again. There are accounts of tech marines who have maintained the same dreadnought for their entire careers, who know every quirk and peculiarity of the machine's systems, who can anticipate the warrior's needs before they are expressed, who have become, in every meaningful sense, the closest thing the interred warrior has to a friend. When such a tech marine eventually dies or is transferred to other duties, the loss can be keenly felt by the dreadnought, who must then adapt to a new caretaker who does not yet understand him, who does not yet speak the unspoken language of electrical impulses and neural feedback that constituted his primary form of connection with the outside world. There is one more category of dreadnought-adjacent technology that deserves mention in any comprehensive exploration of the subject, and that is the various Xenos equivalents that exist across the galaxy. While the term dreadnought properly applies only to the combat walkers of the Imperium and its chaos counterparts, several alien races have developed their own versions of the concept. Machines that serve similar roles on the battlefield, even if the underlying philosophy and technology are radically different. The Eldar, that ancient and declining race whose civilization predates humanity's by millions of years, have their own approach to preserving fallen warriors in mechanical shells. The Wraithlord, a towering construct of psycho-responsive wraithbone, is animated not by a living occupant, but by the soul of a dead Eldar, drawn back from the Infinity Circuit, the psychic repository that stores the spirits of dead Eldar, and placed within a spirit stone mounted in the construct's chest. The Wraithlord moves and fights with a grace that reflects the Eldar's emphasis on elegance and precision, and the warrior within retains his combat skills and at least some of his personality. Though the experience of perceiving the material world through a construct's senses is reportedly disorienting and unpleasant for the Eldar spirit, who perceives the physical world as a dull, muted shadow of the vibrant reality he knew in life. The Eldar also field Wraith Knights, which are even larger constructs that require two spirit stones to operate, one containing the spirit of a dead warrior and the other containing the spirit of a living Eldar, who serves as a psychic guide and anchor for the dead spirit. The living pilot endures a form of psychological strain that is not entirely dissimilar to what a dreadnought's occupant experiences, as the constant contact with a dead consciousness and the alienating experience of perceiving the world through a construct's senses takes its toll over time. The Orcs, those eternally warring greenskins whose technological approach can best be described as enthusiastic improvisation, have their own rough equivalent in the Death Dread. Unlike Imperial dreadnoughts, which are built around the preservation of a dying hero, Def Dreads are often occupied by perfectly healthy orc warriors who simply want the experience of stomping around in a big metal body with lots of weapons attached to it. Orc mech boys, the green skin equivalent of engineers, wire the occupant into the machine in a way that is far cruder than anything the Imperium would accept, but which works well enough by orc standards. The resulting machines are ramshackle, loud, and dangerous to everything in their vicinity, including their own side. But they are also surprisingly effective in the role for which they were designed, getting up close to the enemy and causing the maximum possible amount of destruction. The philosophical contrast between these different approaches to the same basic concept is illuminating. The Imperium views Dreadnought interment as a sacred duty and a terrible sacrifice, dressing it in ceremony and reverence to mask the horror of what it actually entails. The Chaos Forces view it as punishment or desperation, stripping away the pretense and revealing the naked cruelty beneath. The Eldar view it as a necessary but sorrowful compromise, a way of honoring the dead that comes at a cost to the living. And the Orcs view it as a jolly good time, which is perhaps the most honest response of all, is even if it does reflect a species-wide inability to comprehend the concept of consequences. We have covered an enormous amount of ground tonight, from the ancient origins of Dreadnought technology in the forgotten depths of the Dark Age, through the horrifying process of interment that transforms a dying warrior into a living weapon, through the bewildering variety of patterns and variants that different chapters and factions have developed over the millennia, through the psychological devastation that long-term interment inflicts on even the most resilient minds, through the stories of legendary warriors whose experiences inside the sarcophagus have become central to the mythology of the setting. And through all of it, one theme has remained constant: the tension between the machine and the man, between preservation and destruction, and between the honor that the Imperium proclaims and the horror that it conceals. The Dreadnought is, in my view, one of the most perfectly realized concepts in all of Warhammer 40,000, precisely because it embodies that tension so completely. It is both awesome in the original sense of that word, inspiring genuine awe, and awful in every sense of that word, genuinely terrible. It represents the Imperium's greatest strength, its ability to inspire superhuman sacrifice from its servants, and its greatest cruelty, its willingness to demand that sacrifice without regard for the cost to the individuals who bear it. It is a monument to duty and a prison of flesh. It is salvation and damnation wrapped in the same shell of blessed adamantium. When a young space marine looks up at a dreadnought for the first time, here he sees everything that he aspires to be: a hero, a legend, a warrior so great that even death could not end his service. He does not see the man floating in cold fluid behind the armor plates, struggling to remember his own name. He does not hear the silence that fills the stasis vault when the fighting is done and the darkness closes in. He does not feel the slow, creeping dissolution of identity that turns centuries into a long, quiet erosion of everything that once made the warrior who he was. But the man inside the machine sees it all, and he endures it. Not because he has been programmed to endure, not because the machine compels him to endure, but because somewhere, in the organic remnants of a brain that has been fighting its own dissolution for longer than most civilizations last, a spark of something human persists. A fragment of the man he was. A memory of the brother he served beside. A whisper of the oath he swore, so long ago that the words have almost lost their meaning, but not quite. Not yet. And as long as that spark persists, as long as one small fragment of humanity endures within the mechanical shell, the warrior fights on, not for glory, not for honor, not even for the Emperor, in any conscious, reasoned sense. He fights because fighting is the one thing the machine cannot take from him. It is the one moment when the man and the machine are in perfect alignment, when the warrior's will and the weapon's purpose become one and the same, when the darkness recedes and something like life returns, however briefly, to the cold chamber of the sarcophagus. That is the final truth of the Dreadnought. While it is not a machine that happens to contain a man, it is a man who refuses to stop being a man, even after everything that made him one has been systematically stripped away. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where humanity teeters on the edge of extinction and the forces of annihilation press in from every direction, that refusal, that stubborn, defiant insistence on remaining human in the face of dehumanization, may be the most powerful weapon in the entire Imperial arsenal. Not the assault cannon, not the power fist, not the armored shell that can shrug off weapons that would level a city block. The man inside, the choice he makes every time he wakes, to be more than what they have made him. That is what sets a Dreadnought apart from every other weapon in the 41st millennium. And that is what it really takes to become one. The history of the Dreadnought program is illuminated by the stories of individual warriors whose experiences within the sarcophagus have become the stuff of legend. These are not abstract statistics or theoretical discussions. These are the lives, or rather the afterlives, of specific warriors whose names have echoed down through the millennia, whose deeds have inspired generations of battle brothers, and whose suffering has given a human face to the otherwise incomprehensible reality of eternal internment. No discussion of famous dreadnoughts can begin anywhere other than with Bjorn, the fell-handed, of the Space Wolves. Bjorn is, by any measure, the most extraordinary dreadnought in the Imperium, and quite possibly the most extraordinary warrior period. He is the oldest living space marine, was a distinction he has held for roughly 10,000 years, and his personal history reads like a condensed version of the Imperium's own story. Before his internment, Bjorn was a warrior of the Space Wolves Legion during the Great Crusade, serving in the Vulca Fenrica's Third Great Company under the command of Jarl Ogvai. He was a stern, taciturn fighter even then, but one who had earned the respect of his peers through deeds that spoke louder than words ever could. He saw combat in numerous theatres of the Great Crusade and was present at some of the most pivotal moments in Imperial history, including the burning of Prospero, the campaign against the Thousand Suns that remains one of the most controversial events in Space Marine history. It was during the fall of Prospero that Bjorn suffered the wound that would eventually define his legend. The exact details vary depending on which account you follow, but the most widely accepted version involves an encounter with a demonic entity within the ruins of the Thousand Suns' home world. The creature, which had taken the form of the War Master Horus, attempted to use its knowledge of the Space Wolves' true names as a weapon against them, striking down several warriors who came to battle it. When it turned its power on Bjorn, however, the sorcery failed, because the chronicler Caspar Hauser, who had been recording the Space Wolves' history, had always referred to Bjorn by the Low Gothic translation of his name, Bear, rather than his true Fenrisian name. The creature could not gain power over him because it did not truly know him. But the demon was not defeated so easily. In the desperate combat that followed, it managed to grab Bjorn's arm and send a massive surge of warp energy through it, causing his hand to begin smoldering and decaying. The corruption began to crawl up his arm, and only the quick action of an ally who hacked the limb off at the elbow prevented it from spreading to the rest of his body. This injury, combined with the nickname that arose from his use of a lightning claw in combat, earned him the moniker by which he would be known for the rest of his extraordinarily long existence: Bjorn the Fell-Handed. Following the disappearance of his Primarch Lemon Russ, Bjorn was elevated to the position of Great Wolf, the first chapter master of the Space Wolves. He led the chapter for a time before being mortally wounded in battle and interred within the sarcophagus of a Mark V dreadnought. From that point forward, Bjorn became a living bridge between the chapter's mythic past and its ongoing present. A warrior who had walked beside the Primarch and the Emperor himself, now preserved in iron to serve as a repository of memory and wisdom for all the generations that followed. Over the 10,000 years of his internment, Bjorn has been awakened periodically, sometimes for battle, and sometimes simply so that the younger members of the chapter can hear his stories and glean whatever fragments of the old days he is willing to share. And Bjorn, it must be said, is not always a willing raconteur. His internment has not been easy on him. The lore describes him as possessing a powerful, as bitter anger that is directed partly at his Dreadnought status, which he has never fully accepted, and partly at Leman Russ himself for leaving without explanation, apparently without thinking of those he left behind. Bjorn believes, or at least suspects, that Russ left with the foreknowledge that Bjorn would survive as a Dreadnought, and that his incomparably cold anger would keep him alive in battle and sane of mind, able to guard over the Space Wolves throughout the generations. Whether this is true or simply the interpretation of a warrior searching for meaning in his suffering is something that only Bjorn, and perhaps Russ, could answer. Despite his bitterness, Bjorn has served with extraordinary distinction throughout his long internment. Armed with a plasma cannon and his famous True Claw, and a massive lightning claw crafted by the chapter's Iron Priests in homage to the weapon he favored in his previous life, Bjorn has a personal kill count that is estimated to be higher than that of some entire chapters. He has fought in campaigns spanning the full breadth of Imperial history, from the aftermath of the heresy to the battles of the 41st Millennium, and his tactical acumen remains as sharp as ever. When Bjorn walks the battlefield, entire companies of Space Wolves stop to watch, and the morale effect of his presence is incalculable. Bjorn's story is, in many ways, the best-case scenario for Dreadnought internment. He has maintained his sanity, his identity, and his tactical capabilities across a span of time that is almost incomprehensible in human terms, and yet, and even his story is tinged with an unmistakable melancholy. The warrior who once walked beside gods now spends the vast majority of his existence in cold, dark stasis, awakened every century or so to be pestered for stories about a past that grows further away with each telling. He is revered as a hero, but treated as a relic. He is honored as a living legend, but denied the simple pleasures that even the most junior battle brother takes for granted. He is, in the final analysis, alone in a way that no amount of reverence or respect can alleviate. At the opposite end of the spectrum, from Bjorn's enduring clarity, stands the story of ancient Rylanor of the Emperor's Children, a warrior whose tale is one of the most emotionally powerful in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. Rylanor was a Terran-born warrior, one of the original generation of the Third Legion, who had the singular honor of fighting beside the Emperor of Mankind during the Unification Wars. His history was the history of his legion, and he carried battle honors from the earliest campaigns of the Great Crusade etched into his armor. When Rylanor was mortally wounded in battle against the Eldar some decades before the outbreak of the Horus heresy, he was interred within a Contemptor pattern Dreadnought and continued to serve as the Emperor's Children's Ancient of Rites, overseeing the progression of new recruits from novices to full battle brothers. He was respected throughout the Legion, not just for his prowess in combat, but for his ability to perceive falsehood, a trait that would prove tragically ironic given what was about to happen to his legion. Yet when Horus turned traitor and half the Space Marine legions followed him into rebellion, the Emperor's children were among those corrupted, seduced by the Chaos god Slanesh through the influence of their Primarch Fulgrim. But not all of the Emperor's children fell. A significant number of loyalists within the Legion were horrified by what their brothers were becoming and refused to join the betrayal. Rylanor was among them. He was sent with the loyalist elements of the Legion to the surface of Istvan III as part of the virus bombing that the traitor Primarchs orchestrated to purge their legions of those they could not trust to follow them into heresy. Rylanor survived the bombing and the subsequent battles on the surface of Istvan III, fighting alongside other loyalist survivors in a desperate, doomed resistance against their own treacherous brothers. Eventually, he was buried in rubble and presumed dead by the victorious traitors. But Rylanor did not die. He endured, trapped in the ruins of a shattered world, denied the stasis that would have eased his suffering for thousands of years. Think about that for a moment. 10,000 years, alone, on a dead and quarantined world, without the stasis that normally preserves a Dreadnought pilot's sanity. The isolation would be enough to destroy any mind, even one as conditioned and resilient as a Space Marine's. And yet, Rylanor persisted, driven by a single, burning purpose: revenge against the being he held responsible for the destruction of everything he had loved. Not Horus, not chaos, but Fulgrim, his own Primarch, the father who had betrayed his sons. And over those 10,000 years of solitary existence, Rillanor devised a plan. Using components salvaged from the wreckage around him, including a sonic weapon left behind by the traitor Emperor's children, he constructed a device that would serve as a psychic beacon, a lure designed to draw Fulgrim, now a demon prince of Slaanesh, back to the planet where he had committed his greatest crime. And beneath this beacon, Rillanor placed his final weapon, an unexploded virus bomb from the original bombardment, salvaged and prepared for one last act of defiance. When Fulgrim finally answered the call, drawn by the beacon's irresistible summons, he found his ancient son waiting for him. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. Rillanor could not hope to defeat a demon Primarch in combat. But that was never the point. As Fulgrim approached, Rillanor detonated the virus bomb, destroying himself, the beacon, and everything in the immediate vicinity in a final, furious act of rejection. He could not kill Fulgrim, whose demonic nature rendered him immune to physical destruction, but he could deny him the satisfaction of corruption. He could look his treacherous father in the eye and say with his last breath that the Emperor's children had not all fallen, that loyalty had endured where everything else had failed, that even after 10,000 years of suffering, trapped in a metal shell on a dead world, the spirit of defiance was still alive. Rylanor's story stands as one of the most powerful arguments against the idea that Dreadnought interment is merely a curse. For Rylanor, the sarcophagus was not just a prison. It was the vessel that preserved his purpose, that kept the flame of his loyalty burning across millennia, that would have extinguished any merely human spirit. Without the Dreadnought's life support, Rillanor would have died on Istvan 10,000 years before he got the chance to spit in his Primarch's eye. The machine that denied him death also preserved the most essential part of who he was, his unbreakable devotion to the oath he had sworn, and gave him the time he needed to fulfill it. Between the extremes of Bjorn's enduring clarity and Rillanor's monomaniacal purpose, the lore gives us dozens of other named dreadnoughts, whose stories illuminate different aspects of the experience. Brother Davian Thule of the Blood Ravens, familiar to many through the Dawn of War video games, and was a captain who was fatally poisoned by Tyranid bioweapons and interred in a dreadnought as the only means of saving his life. His early experiences as a dreadnought were marked by confusion and difficulty adjusting to his new form, but over time he became more lucid and more capable, suggesting that for some warriors, the initial trauma of interment can be overcome with time and determination. Malkarian of the Night Lords provides a perspective from the other side of the heresy. An ancient captain of the 8th Legion, Malkarian was interred in a dreadnought long before the traitor legions turned from the Emperor's light. His descriptions of dreadnought existence are among the most candid in the lore, portraying it as a form of torture, a cycle of meaningless violence punctuated by periods of empty darkness, with no hope of release and no prospect of anything better. Malkarian's bitterness is compounded by the fact that he serves a warband that does not venerate its dreadnoughts as the Loyalist chapters do, but rather awakens them with grudging reluctance when their firepower is needed and puts them back to sleep the moment the fighting is done. Karab Cullen of the Red Scorpions represents a more recent addition to the ranks of the interred. Cullen was a chapter master, one of the highest-ranking space marines to be interred within a dreadnought, and he was placed within a Leviathan pattern chassis, one of the most powerful, but also most psychologically damaging patterns available. The implications of his internment are sobering. Here is a warrior who was the supreme commander of an entire chapter, and now sealed inside a machine that is known to drive its occupants toward madness. The strategic mind that once directed the movements of 1,000 space marines is now at the mercy of a machine spirit that hungers for his sanity. No exploration of the dreadnought concept would be complete without examining its dark reflection in the ranks of the Chaos Space Marines. When the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror after their defeat at the Siege of Terror, they carried with them their dreadnoughts, along with the broken warriors entombed within them. What happened to those warriors in the millennia that followed stands as one of the most horrifying chapters in the already grim story of Dreadnought internment. In the Imperium, Dreadnought interment is presented as an honor, and while the reality is far more complicated than the propaganda suggests, there is at least a structure of reverence and care surrounding the process. Dreadnoughts are maintained by skilled tech marines. They are placed in stasis between battles to preserve their sanity. They are awakened with ceremony and treated with respect. They are, in the final analysis, valued, both as weapons and as individuals. In the service of chaos, none of this is true. When the traitor legions entered the Eye of Terror, they left behind the technological infrastructure that had made proper Dreadnought maintenance possible. The schism of Mars had already fractured the Mechanicum, and the dark Mechanicum elements that followed the traitors into exile did not share the loyalist tech priests' reverence for preserving knowledge and maintaining standards. Over time, the ability to produce new Dreadnought chassis declined dramatically among the traitor forces. The sophisticated Contemptor pattern, which required exotic materials and specialized knowledge to maintain, became increasingly difficult to keep operational. Simpler patterns like the Castroferum fared somewhat better, but even they suffered from the general degradation of technical capability that afflicted the traitor forces. Worse still, the traitor legions lacked the stasis technology that loyalist chapters used to preserve their Dreadnought's sanity between battles. Without this critical safeguard, interred warriors were left awake and aware through the millennia, their consciousness grinding against the walls of their metal prisons without rest or reprieve. As the psychological effects of this continuous entombment were catastrophic, cut off from the passage of time, denied the merciful oblivion of stasis, exposed to the constant murmur of the warp that permeates the Eye of Terror, these warriors descended into madness with a speed and completeness that makes the gradual deterioration experienced by loyalist dreadnoughts look gentle by comparison. And then there is the warp itself. The corrupting influence of chaos does not stop at the boundaries of flesh and bone. It seeps into metal and circuitry just as readily as it seeps into minds and souls. Over the centuries and millennia of exposure to the raw stuff of the Imperium, the dreadnoughts of the traitor legions began to change. The barrier between the machine and the demonic began to blur. Metal warped and twisted, outgrowing spines and organic-looking growths that pulsed with unnatural life. The machine spirits that inhabited the chassis, already corrupted by their proximity to the warp, merged with the tortured consciousness of the interred warriors to create something that was neither fully mechanical nor fully alive, but some hideous amalgamation of both. The most common result of this process is the Hellbrute, which has become the standard Chaos Dreadnought in the 41st millennium. A Hellbrute is what happens when the body of a warrior within a Dreadnought melds with the chassis itself, the organic and mechanical components fusing until the whole machine appears to be made of demonic flesh. The warrior's consciousness is still present somewhere within this horror, but it is buried so deep beneath layers of pain, madness, and demonic corruption that it can barely be called a consciousness at all. Hellbrutes are completely insane. They rage and thrash and scream, chained in the holds of chaos warships between battles, their fury so great that they must be physically restrained to prevent them from destroying everything around them. When they are unleashed in battle, they do not fight with any tactical sophistication. They simply kill, driven by a hatred and agony that has been building for thousands of years, directed at everything and nothing, an endless howl of suffering given mechanical form. Unlike the loyalist Imperium, which treats Dreadnought internment as an honor, many Chaos warbands use it as a punishment. Warriors who have displeased their lords, who have failed in their duties, or who have simply attracted the wrong kind of attention, can find themselves forcibly interred within a Dreadnought sarcophagus as a form of torture. The Red Corsairs, a notorious renegade warband, are known to keep interred warriors awake and immobile in complete sensory deprivation for years or even decades, denying them even the basic stimulation of combat as they slowly go mad in the darkness of their metal prisons. There are exceptions to this general pattern of degradation and madness. Some Chaos Dreadnoughts, particularly those of the more organized and disciplined traitor legions like the Iron Warriors and the Thousand Sons, have retained a greater degree of coherence and tactical capability. The Ferrum Infernus designation is used for Chaos Dreadnoughts of the Castroferrum pattern that have not yet mutated into Hellbrutes. And some of these machines still house warriors who are, if not entirely sane, at least lucid enough to follow orders and fight with something resembling strategic purpose. The Chaos Contemptor Dreadnought, an ancient relic from the Heresy era, is prized above almost all other machines by the warbands that possess one, maintained with whatever resources can be scrounged or stolen. The Horus Heresy also saw the emergence of unique dreadnought variants among the traitor legions that reflected the specific corruption of each. The Word-bearers created the Mara Gal-tainted dreadnought, whose occupant was one of the Gal Vorbak, warriors who had been possessed by demons, and then fused with the dreadnought chassis itself, creating something that was as much demon engine as combat walker. Yet the World Eaters developed berserker dreadnoughts whose pilots had been driven to the absolute extremity of rage by the butcher's nails implants that the Legion favored, creating machines that fought with a fury that was terrifying even by dreadnought standards. The Emperor's children fielded sonic dreadnoughts, whose weapons had been replaced with devastating sonic blasters that reflected the Legion's worship of Slanesh and their obsessive pursuit of sensation in all its forms. Each of these variants represents a different answer to the question of what happens when dreadnought technology is combined with the corrupting influence of chaos. And in every case, the answer is the same: suffering. The warriors inside these machines suffer more, not less, than their loyalist counterparts. Their madness is deeper. Their isolation is more complete. Their fate is more terrible. For a loyalist dreadnought, there is at least the comfort of duty, the knowledge that one's suffering serves a purpose, that the chapter one loves benefits from one's continued existence. For a Chaos Dreadnought, there is only pain and the slow, grinding certainty that things will never get better, only worse, always worse. So where does all of this leave us? What is the final answer to the question that we posed at the beginning of this journey? What does it really take to become a dreadnought in Warhammer 40,000? The obvious answer is that it takes catastrophic injury. It takes being so thoroughly destroyed in body that even the miracles of space marine medicine cannot put you back together. It takes having your remaining flesh cut from your ruined frame and sealed in a coffin full of cold fluid and wired into a machine that will become your body, your prison, and your world for the rest of your existence. But the deeper answer, the one that I hope this exploration has made clear, is that becoming a dreadnought takes something much more than that. It takes the loss of everything that makes you who you are, not all at once, but gradually, inexorably, over the course of centuries and millennia that stretch out before you like an infinite corridor with no doors and no end. It takes watching the faces of your brothers grow young and strange, as generation after generation lives and dies while you sleep. It takes feeling your memories fade, like old photographs left in the sun, the colors bleaching away, until all that remains is a vague impression of something that might once have been important. And it takes learning to walk on legs that are not yours, to fight with hands that are weapons, to speak with a voice that is not your own, and eventually to wonder if the man you used to be was ever anything more than a story told about someone else. It takes courage. Not the straightforward courage of charging into enemy fire or holding the line against impossible odds, though dreadnoughts do both of those things with depressing regularity. It takes the quieter, more persistent kind of courage that is required to face each awakening, knowing that you will be a little less than you were the last time. It takes the courage to keep fighting, keep serving, keep choosing to be human in whatever way you still can, even as the machine slowly, inexorably, erases every trace of that humanity from your consciousness. Some warriors find this courage in duty. The Emperor requires their service, and they will provide it regardless of the personal cost, because that is what they swore to do when they took their oaths, and a space marine does not break his oaths. Others find it in brotherhood, in the connections they forge with the warriors who fight beside them, connections that are fragile and temporary because everyone they befriend will eventually die while they endure, but which still provide moments of warmth and meaning in an existence that is otherwise defined by cold metal and empty darkness. Some find it in defiance, in the stubborn refusal to let the machine win, to be reduced to nothing more than a weapons platform with a name. And some, it must be said, find it in the hope that this awakening will be the last, and that death will finally come and grant them the rest they have been denied for so long. There is a quote attributed to a Blood Angels battle captain named Mordasi that captures the duality of Dreadnought existence better than any other words I have encountered. He is reported to have said that to be interred within a Dreadnought is both a curse and the highest honor. You are forever divorced from the flesh, yet you become eternal. You become a weapon, a monument, and a mentor. Sleep is but a memory. That is the paradox at the heart of the Dreadnought concept. It is simultaneously the greatest gift and the most terrible punishment that the Imperium can bestow upon its heroes. It is both salvation and damnation, preservation and destruction, honor and horror, bound together so tightly that they cannot be separated. Yet in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Dreadnoughts walk. They walk because they are told to walk. They fight because they are told to fight. They endure because they have no other choice. But within each one, somewhere in the cold darkness behind the ceramite and adamantium, a consciousness persists. A man who once had hands and eyes and a voice of his own. A man who once knew what it felt like to breathe air and feel sunlight and hear laughter that was not filtered through mechanical senses. A man who gave everything he had and everything he was in service to something he believed in, and who was rewarded for that sacrifice with an eternity of isolation, violence, and the slow, inevitable dissolution of everything that once made him who he was. That is what it takes to become a Dreadnought. And not just the wounds, not just the surgery, not just the machine. It takes a kind of sacrifice that goes beyond anything the Imperium's propaganda could adequately describe, a surrender of self, so complete that even the warrior himself may not fully comprehend its magnitude until centuries of interment have shown him what he has lost. And yet, they serve. Century after century, millennium after millennium, through wars that dwarf anything in human history, against enemies that would destroy the very fabric of reality if left unchecked, the Dreadnoughts serve. They are the oldest soldiers in the Imperium's armies, the most experienced, the most revered, and the most tragic. They are living monuments to sacrifice and duty, walking testaments to the lengths the Imperium will go to preserve its warriors and the prices it will extract from them in return. The next time you see a Dreadnought on the battlefield, whether it is stomping through enemy lines in a video game, standing tall on a tabletop among painted miniatures, or striding through the pages of a novel, spare a thought for the man inside. Not the machine, not the weapons, not the armor, the man, the one who is still in there, somewhere, floating in cold fluid in the dark, connected to a world he can no longer touch through sensors that show him everything, but let him feel nothing. He was a hero once. He still is, in a way. But the cost of that heroism is something that no prayer can adequately address and no glory can fully justify. It is a cost measured in centuries of solitude, in memories that dissolve like mist, in a voice that is no longer your own speaking words, that no longer carry the warmth they once did. It is a cost that the Imperium asks its greatest champions to pay, and that they pay silently, faithfully, endlessly, in the deepest halls of fortress monasteries across 1,000,000 worlds. For in the grim darkness of the far future, even death is not an escape from duty. And for the warriors of the Adeptus Astartes, who find themselves sealed within the sarcophagus of a Dreadnought, duty is the only thing that remains, when everything else has been taken away. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of Warhammer 40,000, I would really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to Q on 40K. Every subscription helps this channel grow and allows me to keep producing these long-form explorations of the setting's richest and most compelling lore. If there are other topics you would like me to cover in this same depth, drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and your suggestions are what keep this channel going. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, somewhere in the darkness, the ancients are sleeping, and they will wake again when they are needed.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.